Ladies and metalfish, this is your hard-boiled and handsome duelist, Daddy Janjo here. So, February 4th, 1999 saw the first core set to the Yu-Gi-Oh! OCG. Volume 1 would be the first time duelists would get their hands on the card game manufactured by Konami. This would be a small set comprised of only 40 cards, many of which the TCG to this day still never received, like Archfiend Mirror. But the biggest difference wouldn't be the card pool, rather the rule set. From the 1999 rulebook that was included in the starter box, we got the official rules, which were different from the rule set we're familiar with. Here are the main rules. Your deck must contain 40 cards with no upper limit. You also need a 10-card side deck. The starting player does not draw. You can place on the field one of each card type per turn, monster, magic, and trap. So no mass activating sparks. Advanced summoning does not exist either, which translates to no tribute summoning. This means any monster with 5 or higher stars can be normal summoned like any other monster. The stars at this point were more of a form of rarity than indicator of a summoning mechanic. These are the general rules that you can imagine makes the game quite different and slow. It's more in line with Forbidden Memories if you played that game. Konami was trying to make the game feel like the manga, and in that regard, they succeeded. Was it ultimately enjoyable? In terms of combo potential, perhaps it had a low ceiling. With the rules established, how did the set make up the first meta game? Despite there being 40 cards in the premiere set, only a handful of them were actually meta viable. Even though the pack included Blue Eyes White Dragon on the cover, the legendary Dragon of Destruction was not among any of those 40 cards. When it comes to monsters, they follow a tier system for strength. Tier 1 would be exclusive to the two high-level monsters, Gaia the Fierce Knight and Dark Magician. With both having over 2,000 attack, these two are your boss monsters, with attack significantly higher than any other card in the set. It was rare to see these cards back then because not only were they the ultra rares of the set, making them harder to pull from a pack in an age where that was your only option, there were fewer card shops and toy stores would only have a small section for trading cards. Basically, you had to buy packs in bulk and pray you pulled the bosses. The Tier 2 monsters would be the pillars of the deck, Mammoth Graveyard, Hitatsumi Giant, and Silverfang, all monsters with 1200 attack. This tier was defined by their over 1000 attack power, and even their defense was to be feared from all base stat Tier 3 monsters. You had to play 3 of each of these to have a respectable deck. Tier 3 would be monsters defined by mainly the 800 power line, Dark Gray, Nemoriko, Kurama, Kagemusha of the Blue Flame, the Furious Sea King, and Petite Angel for its high 900 defense. Decks would run these cards just due to them being the remaining decent cards in comparison to the weaker options of Volume 1 like Tomosaurus. Technically speaking, you could consider there being a Tier 4 in relation to the 700 attack line. However, these monsters would be saved for a heavy tribal route like Miotoko for warriors or Sectarian of Secrets for spellcasters. You'd be hard pressed to run something like Thunder Kit since no Thunder equipped magic existed by this point. Alternatively, you could run whatever you wanted, Thunder Deck and all, it just wouldn't be anything worth including on a meta tier list. And just to point it out, the Fire attribute did not exist yet. Fire Reaper and Fire Grass tried their best. Even though effect monsters did not exist yet either, your normal monster lineup did matter. This is because of equipped magic, the spice of Volume 1. The cards were important in deck building to gain advantage in the battle phase in an era where monsters had similar attack potency. There were 5 equips, and all 5 increase a specific type by 300 attack and defense, and even still, not all equips were created equal. Let's take a look at what we got. Violet Crystal existed for zombies with 2 targets in Fire Reaper and Fiend's Hand. Reaper has 700 attack, so it's already a tough sell. And Fiend can get up to 900 defense, but with 600 base attack, it adds little to an underwhelming start to zombies. Power of Kaishin boosts Aqua monsters, which like Crystal only have 2 targets, Furious Sea King and Hito Denchak. The Starfish Anemone is like Fiend in regards to being decent for boosted defense, whereas Sea King is a playable tier 3 monster by itself. Now we run into the issue of having an equip card that is too specific to be considered great. The remaining 3 equip cards are more intriguing. Legendary Sword is for warriors, and its best use is to let you attack over Dark Magician with Gaia. Having a card to let you punch over the strongest monster in the game while letting you save your other forms of removal is a good move, I like to think. Alternatively, you can use Sword for Kagemusha for another boosted tier 3 monster. In a similar situation, Book of Secret Arts will keep your Dark Magician strong while allowing you to beat over opposing magicians or crashing with other buffed up wizards. Nemarika would make for a solid secondary target. The last equip introduced in Volume 1 is Beast Fangs, which is made for, well, beast monsters. Unlike the other equips, this is the only one to be usable with a tier 2 monster, Silver Fang. So despite Hitatsumi Giant having higher defense, the attack buff will allow Fang to beat over its brethren. This makes Fang the third best monster and makes Beast Fangs a powerful tool alongside Book and Sword as the main equip magic options. Dark Gray would be the tier 3 option for this magic, only making Beast Fangs more worth playing. With all the equip magic, you have to keep in mind that while they do have benefits, if you lose a monster with an equip spell, you lose 2 cards in the process. In addition, if you use an equip magic on a tier 3 monster, they still won't be able to beat over a tier 2 monster, making that strategy riskier. But as you can see, due to the equip spell and high attack monster options, duelists tended to stick to spellcasters, warriors, and beast type monsters. If you wanted to get rid of monsters without the need of equip magic, then you have a few options. Fissure will destroy the weakest enemy monster. While its single removal is very useful, you have to remember that a Gaia can take a hit for DM or a tier 3 monster for anything higher. For a true palette cleanser, there's Dark Hole, which destroys all monsters on the field. Just watch out for your own, which thankfully you can still conduct your normal summon after activating the spell card. This is a powerful card if used optimally. The third of the 3 holes is Trap Hole, the one and only trap card in the set. It takes care of any over 1,000 attack threat when they initially hit the field, so you must use this right away, but it does get rid of the big threats, and more so considering Graveyard Revival was not around quite yet. Your opponent may even set a DM to play around it, if they don't fear you'll attack over it with Gaia. You could even bluff a set hole by setting a different card. This also adds a benefit to the sub 1k monster. Given how slow the format is, this Hole of the Trap variety could be considered a stun card. Red Medicine and Sparks would be released in Volume 1 too, but don't play those cards. And that was it when it came to beaters, equips, and forms of removal. Volume 1 format was defined by powerful core cards and ratios. Your tech options could include something like more specific equip magic, more beaters in general, or Petite Angel as a sole use defender against tier 3 monsters. It's quite fascinating in the sense that any meta-contending deck looked more or less the same. 3 of each of the tier 1 and tier 2 monsters, typically 3 to 6 equip cards, 3 Dark Gray to make Beast Fangs brick less, perhaps some tier 3 monsters make further use of additional power equips, and maybe Kurama for a solid attack and defense for a tier 3 monster, and of course 3 of each removal cards. Don't get me wrong, Volume 1 format is not particularly exciting, dense, or skill-intensive. After all, it was the first set in a long history of releases for the game. Nevertheless, it was the first format in the game and important to take a look at. Even if historically this was more of a sealed format, the cards introduced did give the earliest duelists a chance to understand attack potency and the use of back row cards. Many games came down to luck of the draw and caveman go bonk. Hell, I've had a duel on my channel in this format, and to my surprise, I had a lot of fun with it, given the simplified rules and overall meta. Every game needs a foundation, and Volume 1 did that with only room to grow. Volume 1 for OCG Yu-Gi-Oh! Wasn't anything wild, but it was a start. You could say it was humble beginnings with Silver Fang and Dark Magician being tier 0 cards. Yet there was a clear lack of variety, as your only imprint of personality was a few ratios in regards to equip magic. And as a card game, it is only natural that new cards come out to entice players to spend more money to try out new paper, magic, and wizards. Well, in the first month of the game, February 1st through the 21st, 1999, there was the Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters National Tournament that revolved around the video game Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters, simply titled. The primordial set wasn't enough for a reasonable tournament. However, this Game Boy game that predates the OCG by 2 months, December 16, 1998, already had an established card pool. In many ways, it was a prototype to the OCG, and by the card game's physical release, the game could be seen as an alternate format. Thus, the tournament went off this game, which, thank God, the OCG didn't completely follow. Could you imagine if Diane Keto the Cure could recover 5,000 life points? Or Tremendous Fire dishing out 5,000 life points? I'd rather not ponder. The tournament is notable for there were cards to be given out at the event. And I don't mean cards in-game, as there were a few like Stuffed Animal and Fairy's Gift. Rather, cards to play for the OCG. All attendees received a copy of Kanan the Sword Mistress, which had 1400 attack and 1400 defense. Compared to her contemporaries, this was not only a 200 attack increase, but a significant defense increase too. This female warrior who floats like a butterfly and stings like a bee can only be destroyed by battle by Dark Magician, Gaia the Fierce Knight, or by a Silver Fang equipped with Beast Fangs. If you wanted to increase in power for your deck, then you had better ensured you went to this event. Top 4 duelists would receive prize cards, with each ranking receiving more of the cards the higher place they won. Top 4 would get Fiend's Mirror, which, while still having a high attack, could not beat over Gaia. Top 3 would get Super War Lion, which matches Gaia's stats, but could not beat Dark Magician. Top 2 would get Zero the Mant with a whopping 2,800 attack that is damn respectable. And for the winner, the Spoils with Black Luster Soldier, wielding a hefty 3,000 attack, the first for the OCG. The savvy duelists will instantly notice that these cards have always been printed as blue-colored ritual monsters. Well, after this they were, as this was the only printing of these cards to be normal monsters, aside from an OCG event in 2023. Although, according to the valuable Book 1, the physical prize cards were printed on stainless steel, making them illegal for play. So obviously, no. These cards had no impact on the game itself, aside from what they were: trophies. And that was the first big Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournament. In regards to the OCG, it was Kanan or bust. But early additions to the card pool did not stop there. On March 1st, 1999, there was Booster 1, a small 40 card set with some Volume 1 reprints. This wasn't actually a set released in booster packs, rather it was distributed via card-ass vending machines. These machines started in 1988 with Saint Seiya cards, and would be the way Bandai would distribute Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards when they had the license. But now they're back, in which you purchase a set of 3 cards. Trading card games are gambling? Nah. Anyways, here's a randomized vending machine. A quick thing to note is that the cards were printed slightly differently than core sets, as they needed to be designed to fit in machines and keep in mind how they operate. This meant the cuts were different, backs tend to be darker, and there was a different gloss on the cards. It may be hard to notice, however with the trained eye, you may see that your opponent's top deck would not be that Volume 1 Gaia. They also included one fact card or rule card that told you how to play the game. This is important because this is the first time the rules were publicly available since a rulebook had yet to be released by this point. Who knew learning the game would require a gotcha system? These would be included in all future booster sets. The tagline for B1 is, quote, "The prideful duel of truth begins now," unquote. Truth is right, as this set sucks. This is a set that doesn't shift the meta in any particular direction. After all, this is what it says, a booster of sorts. Nothing in the 40 cards is of the same level as Dark Magician, let alone Kanan or even Silver Fang. A majority of the set are sub-optimal monsters like Ancient Jar, Happy Lover, or Drollbird. You did have a few new 900 attack line monsters like Doron, Hurricane, Vishwar Randy, and more, which helped tier 3 monsters. Beforehand, they were 800 beaters, and now you had a plethora of monsters to upgrade your deck with. It didn't stop there, as there were a couple of new, relatively heavy-hitting cards in the 1000 attack line, Ryukyushin and Watt Kid. Despite them not fitting in any popular warrior, beast, or spellcaster deck, their 1k power did allow them dominance over any tier 3 card. On the flip side, we have Battle Warrior with 1k defense, which means your opponent would need a strong monster to topple this wall. Battle Warrior stall? Stall mill, eat your heart out. Another thing B1 accomplished were the first reprints. So if you miss out on some key equip cards like Legendary Sword or Beast Fangs, then this was your second chance in obtaining those. Yet, reprinting equips wasn't just for show, as clearly that was the focus strategy moving forward. Now you have more tribal synergy and thus more personality-driven deck building. Warrior and spellcasters would get the best deal out of this with their 900 line, and even zombies got something to use too. Only a handful of cards from Booster 1 would make their way to the TCG, like Ryukyushin, Watt Kid, and the Shadow who controls the dark. A majority of the new cards have remained in the OCG, like Gate Deeg, Weather Control, and Phantom Dawan. Yet, many of them would receive recolors to sneak their way into the West, like Sinkar and Pale Beast, or Man-Eating Plant and Dark World Thorns. This would also be the premier set for the Fire attribute, so despite Booster 1 not doing a ton, it still steered the meta in a certain way, even if it was already geared in the equipment direction. Just now the threshold of power was increased in both ways of tribalism and good stuff. You want to keep your deck up to speed? Well, then you better prepare to press your luck on the card-ass machines. It was certainly the boost the game needed for this Kanon format, even if it was a single step in the desert of Yu-Gi-Oh! So far, we've covered the first core set and the first expansion set in the OCG, in addition to the first tournament, even if it was played via the Duel Monsters video game. Well, as time marches forward, so does the scope of the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And this is in many ways, as March 6, 1999 marks the last hurrah of the Bandai game. Yeah, that weird first iteration of Yu-Gi-Oh! I covered years ago pops its fiendish head up from the venomous swamp with the Toei Yu-Gi-Oh! Movie. I won't go into the movie itself, as I'll save that for another video if you're all interested, perhaps a sub bonus. Keynote here is the movie featured two obtainable promotional cards for the now dead game in Blue Eyes White Dragon's 3-body connection and Wicked Chain. When combined, it allowed the White Dragon to attack up to 8 times. Whoa! This is not to say it was the only important factor from this event. On the same day the film premiered at the 1999 Toei Animation Fair, you could pick up the first ever Yu-Gi-Oh! OCG starter box. This was a package that contained everything you needed to jumpstart you playing Yu-Gi-Oh! It contained a deck with a deck box, a playmat, 50 score sheets, a calculator, a rule book, and even star chips like in the Duelist Kingdom arc in the manga. I've already gone over the basic rules in the Volume 1 video, so I won't go over the basics here, but there are some interesting rules to bring up. Firstly is the ante rule. Yeah, betting was legal early on, assuming both players agreed to it if invoked. Betting worked on two fronts, first of which were the aforementioned star chips. You got 6 chips in total, 3 bronze, 2 silver, and 1 gold. You could also bet cards themselves, which before you drew your opening hand, you would mill whatever amount of bet cards and ante those. Said cards could not be used in the same match, and should you lose cards from a 40-card deck, then you could add from the side. Keep in mind that before each game, you had to count your 10-card side to your opponent to show them your side was legal, sans adding after ante. Other notable rules include the mention of the Exodia win condition, even though the card did not exist in any facet yet. Another interesting thing is that magic cards are mentioned to be destroyed after use, aside from cards that power up monsters and another card type I'll cover later. Wild trap cards must include self-destruction card text. Remember, card icons have yet to exist. Speaking of equipped magic cards, they are stacked on top of the monster and still count towards your 5 back row limit. There's a few more elements in regards to some specifics, so I'll cover those in a little bit. Going back to the Toei Animation Fair, if you played the OCG, you had to pick this box up as only 5,000 copies were sold. Furthermore, it included 5 unique monsters that would be swapped out for a public release. And they were solid cards like the 13th Grave and Dark King of the Abyss with 1200 attack each, and Turtle Tiger with 1500 defense. Trial of Nightmare had an outstanding 1300 attack, which dominated the previously strong low-level monsters, not counting Kanan. But the best monster from the theatrical release had to be Aqua Mador. The second word in its name could possibly be a rewording of Mado, which means magic. Given this is a spellcaster monster, this makes sense. Perhaps Water Wizard is a more suitable name. Anyways, this card was strong upon release due to its outstanding 2000 defense. No low-level monster could attack over it, and if you had Book of Secret Arts equipped, then it blocked Gaia too. And with a 1200 attack stat, it could hold its own against contemporary beaters as well. Keep in mind that, like Kanan, the rarity of Mador meant it wasn't a widespread meta-warping card. When the starter box received its public release on March 18, 1999, the replaced cards weren't too notable, with cards like King Fog being okay in regards to Booster 1, and Rock Ogre Grotto No. 2 having solid defense. However, if you pre-ordered the box, then you got a nice bonus in Celtic Guardian, a monster with comparable stats to Kanan. If you had a lot of money, then you would definitely wanted to pre-order 3 boxes for this. Although, again, like Kanan and Mador, the rarity of the Elf Swordsman made it not so common to see, especially at 3 copies. With 50 new cards, a highlight was surprisingly the defensive cards. Ancient Tree of Enlightenment and Green Phantom King had 1500 and 1600 defense respectively. Monsters like this and the previously stated Turtle Tiger were hard to beat over unless you use a high level monster, and their low attack made them magnets for Fissure, which could be a positive or negative depending on the game state. Quite honestly, a majority of the cards were weak, but that only made the cream rise to the top quicker. Monster-wise, this peaked with Blue Eyes White Dragon. Yeah, the legendary Dragon of Destruction, who was on the cover of Volume 1, finally makes their paper debut as the, still to this day, strongest attack for a normal monster, sitting at a whopping 3,000 attack. Dark Magician may be the ultimate wizard, however, Blue Eyes was the king in terms of attack and defense. A 3k attack could destroy any existing monster aside from an incredibly buffed up DM or Gaia. And 2500 defense meant DM couldn't punch over it either. Shysta! Expect this card to define the meta moving forward. The starter box also included some rather interesting back row cards. Polymerization was a first here that introduced fusion monsters and the fusion deck. With no limit in the deck, you may think bringing out a powerful 1800 attack Flame Swordsman would be great. Unfortunately, this was not the case, as according to the rulebook, in order to fuse, you must have both materials on field. This meant it took at least 2 turns to fuse, and an 1800 attack stat with weak materials otherwise would not be worth it in the face of Gaia or Mador. Also, some of the purple cards like Fusionist and Dark Fire Dragon didn't even include all their materials in the box, so if you play prior, you might have the cards from Volume 1. I suppose this was a way to get duels to pick up products ASAP to incentivize possible future releases. Needless to say, fusions were DOA due to their slowness and lack of firepower. Another new element was field magic cards. These are unique as they activate in the field zone, and it does count towards your 5 back row limit. Weird. They gave a field-wide boost, which could be beneficial at times, or even disadvantageous if your opponent gains the edge. It's not like the monsters received a major buff, and tribal decks weren't great. So if you did want to play the strategy, you may have to compromise by running weaker monsters. And if your opponent played one while yours is on field, then yours got overridden and destroyed. The starter box field cards would technically have a different name, as you may tell. It needed a separation from its green brethren to note the necessary field zone. As such, it was called a field magic card instead of the other two magic types simply referred to as magic cards. In terms of magic cards, the only notable new inclusion is not one to bypass: Raigeki. This Thunderbolt is a simple, one-sided dark hole that says it all in one sentence. Quote, destroy all of the opponent's monsters, unquote. Using Raigeki to deal with a dragon or using it to direct attack with your own was nothing to scoff at. It's not the length of the effect that matters, it's how you use it. In regards to traps, there was slim pickings. Two-pronged attack was uncomfortable, since it was the only trap removal and additional removal otherwise for people who weren't able to obtain the power cards in Volume 1. Work with what you have, I suppose. Then there's Dragon Capture Jar, which, while continuous traps technically did not exist, the card just didn't have self-destruction card text. It was a soft removal for Dragon that didn't deal with the problem at hand, yet it could cause a stalemate. The only out was the only back row removal in Remove Trap. Since Jar was in essence an animal trap, Remove Trap's art being a broken snare has to be a cheeky reference. Yes, in regards to utility, this was the original White Hole. Starter box format definitely shifted the meta. A bougie build can consist of a lot of strong beaters, but a defensive build can also work wonders while still using the popular equip strategy. Cards like Celtic Guardian, Aquamador, Blue Eyes White Dragon, and Raigeki were definitely staples in a modern sense. I suppose a Yami or Sogen build was possible if you want to play a rogue, more tribal strategy. Even if you pre-ordered 3 boxes and just used that, the bones of the meta were still there with beaters and defenders alike. Really, the box was geared towards explosive cards and defensive monsters being a primary focus. It was Konami's first real attempt to get people into the physical game, much like how starter deck Yugi and Kaiba were, and I can attest to that. After all, a rulebook is significantly more valuable than rule cards from Booster 1, and all things considered, the starter box was a must-buy at the time. But can Konami keep the hype train going past this spring? The answer may just surprise you. Only 9 days removed from the starter box's release on March 27, 1999, we finally get Volume 2. The idea of a volume set when compared to a booster set was to give the game a stronger push and make gameplay more exciting, akin more to a chapter as opposed to supplemental material. That said, was V2 able to do what it set out to accomplish? The set contained 40 cards, with all aside from 6 making their way to the West. Of those, I feel that Wood Remains and I have the most in common with. In regards to attack-potent monsters, there's slim pickings. Very few hit that 1200 plus threshold with the likes of Tyhone and Terra the Terrible, or as I like to call him, Shrek. The best of the common strikers has to be Urabi, whose name translates to Wild Raptor. It stacks a whopping 1500 attack stat that beats over Celtic Guardian or any contemporary from the V1 era. In regards to truly strong monsters, we only received one, Curse of Dragon. With a 2k attack stat, it can certainly beat over Urabi, yet it remains much weaker than its ultra-rare brethren. Another point of contention is that it is helpless against Aquamador, who equals it with a 2k defense stat. So in a way, the premier 5-star monster creates a middle ground between the high and low level monster lines. Curse of Dragon's position is further established thanks to the addition of more 2k defenders, Mystical Elf and Spirit of the Heart. Unlike Aquamador, these two monsters lack in power, yet are more available with Heart being a common and thus had a wider spread. Technically speaking, Elf is better than Harp due to synergy with Yami and Book of Secret Arts. Nonetheless, being able to block a variety of monsters aside from 3 cemented the idea of the wall monster. Quite honestly, V2 adjusted Duelist ideology that monsters could be important for just defense alone, more than the utility the starter box introduced. That said, V2 had more than just strong monsters. While being one of the only sets to not include a single trap card, there were plenty of new magic and equip magic cards. The equips follow the typology philosophy, now including Fiend, plant, dinosaur, insect, and machine. Only 2 of these had any potential right out the gate, one of which was Raised Body Heat, which, when equipped, gave a dinosaur monster a 300 attack boost. This could be used with Mammoth Graveyard, but more importantly Yorubi to add some additional offensive pressure even if it couldn't beat over a wall. It's reminiscent of Beast Fangs and Silver Fang or Legendary Sword and Kanon, even if Raised Body Heat isn't an immediate deck inclusion. The other potential equip card was Dark Energy that worked on Fiend monsters with 2 usable targets in Trial of Nightmare and the newly released Terror the Terrible. At the very least, a monster with 1300 attack was solid if you didn't pre-order the starter box 3 times to get that playset of Celtic Guardian. This is in conjunction with the Yami deck I mentioned in the last video as probably the best tribal deck, which was essentially just the best of the worst. Since with Dark Energy, you'd be pressed to play weaker monsters than the bougie build, where that is already roaring to play Yorubi and thus could fit in Raised Body Heat more naturally. All the other equip magic confirmed the notion that tribal strategies needed more than a thematic card to make the deck work. Laser Cannon Armor's best target was Kumutoko, which could only make use of the equip's defensive purpose. That said, it would be more beneficial to play a wall. The same issue applies to Vile Germs, although Green Phantom King is a much better card that can defend against Yorubi by itself. Lastly, there was Machine Conversion Factory, which at first glance may seem odd. What the hell is a machine monster? Yeah, V2 was the first set to introduce machine monsters into the game, even if it was just one in Hologra. So right away, the equip only had one single target, and it was an 1100 attack attacker, which wouldn't amount to much. It reminds me of the equip in the TCG's Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon set, and the limited options we had in the West, Steel Ogre Grotto number 1 and Metal Dragon. Normal magic wise, both burn and heal cards got an upgrade even if no one played them. But if you wanted to deal with the green pieces of paper, then Dispel was for you. This card destroys all kinds of magic, including field magic cards. This is in contrast to Remove Trap's singular target system. But remember that the official rules are still in play, and as such, if you should activate Dispel to destroy a field magic or an equip magic, then you can't activate another magic card that same turn. So do you activate it or save it in favor of your own power card? One important rule to note is that the original text translates to, quote, destroy one magic card located on the field, unquote. The text is a bit ambiguous since unlike in Yugi Kaiba format, where you can use Dispel on a face down to see if it's a trap hole or a bluff to make a safer, more educated play, the starter box rulebook doesn't specify whether a face down card is considered a magic or trap card, or if it's an unknown. According to an FAQ card later down the booster series, it specifies the rules regarding cards like Dispel and Arm Ninja. We don't have any documentation before this, so while I can't confidently say one way or another, there was the possibility that you could not use Dispel on face-down cards by this point. Speaking of power cards, one of note is Swords of Revealing Light. As the game's first ultra-rare magic card, this is a great stall tool against offensive pressure, as well as revealing enemy face-down monsters. It must be stated that the initial printing has a confusing translation where it wasn't clear on if it was only the opponent's monsters that got flipped face up, as it roughly translates to, quote, all enemy monsters are unable to attack for 3 turns. When used, the backside of a monster is turned to its front side, unquote. It was evident that it meant opposing monsters, seeing as Swords would get an errata later in the spring. Another weird aspect early on is that Swords was treated as a residual effect, where it wouldn't stay on field, yet its effect would remain, meaning Dispel was useless against it. Nevertheless, this was seen as an all-purpose replacement to Dragon Capture Jar, since it could be used regardless of the situation and did not deter your own cards. This made it one of the most popular cards from V2 and an immediate staple. The final key card from V2 was the game's first revival card, the super rare Monster Reborn. Firstly, the art is way different from how you remember seeing it. Many cards from the OCG to the TCG did get changed, whether for religious or sexual reasons. We've seen this with cards like Kanon and Final Flame. In Reborn's case, its original artwork is that of an Ankh, an ancient Egyptian symbol that symbolizes aspects of life. I think it's a bit silly that Konami felt the need to change a rather common symbol. Perhaps it was due to Christians continuing to use the symbol that caused concern by the censorship team. Although counterpoint, it was used as a modern symbol of counterculture in the 1960s, so who's to say what the ultimate decision was based on? But hey, then we wouldn't get that weird ornate whatever it is. Monster Reborn has a simple effect where you can revive any monster from the graveyard. Essentially, this was a counter to Trap Hole. Of course, it had more utility than that, since you can revive a monster that was destroyed at any point. If you brought back a Blue Eyes, then the game could shift in your favor. Not even Trap Hole can stop you. To specify this further, since this is an in-depth look at the OCG and not two dudes progressing through Wikipedia articles, Trap Hole's translation only mentions a monster summoned. So does this mean Reborn falls under this condition? Short answer is no, as special summoning does not exist in the game yet, and Reborn translates as putting a monster from the grave under your control. Fun OCG wording, yay! Either the case, Reborn may be the oldest revival card, yet it's the best revival card. And that's the card pool for Volume 2. The new monsters didn't blow anything out of the water, yet the gap between strong and weak monsters increased, and new fusions continue to disappoint. V2 improved the game for lower tier monsters, more push towards tribal strategies, and higher rarity spells that became instant staples, even if only roughly 25% of V2 was meta relevant. One complaint is that it kept the status quo in regards to a metagame existing via stat superiority. Beat over weak monsters with strong monsters, and if you can't, use a board wipe. Sure, you could play other decks, but doing so was a losing gambit. Evidently, Konami was still heavy on the equip philosophy since they viewed it as a beatdown format needing equip magic to make a difference. To be fair, this was early in the game with young players and no local tournament results, so we don't exactly know the meta scene apart from guesswork and a couple people posting about their memories online. Of course, many of these decks are built with the card pool in mind and not as much the difficulty and hindsight of building and buying the most optimal deck. So these decks, if anything, are more conceptual. So hope you play well and ante the right cards to build your best deck. With keeping the balance, the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! May have felt like the manga, yet the game was essentially stagnant. Something had to give, because otherwise Konami would just print stronger monsters on loop and the cycle would create a Mobius strip. The company would have to look at things from a different perspective if they want Yu-Gi-Oh! To grow and survive. Konami would need to view it from an expert's perspective, and only one word would be able to describe what was about to happen: a revolution. The game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Was developed by looking at the manga and how Takahashi wrote his duels. In many ways, Konami translated this successfully by making the duels feel like they're Yugi summoning Dark Magician hot off the top deck. But a manga and a playable card game are two different entities, and what worked with one may not hold the same weight as the other. So despite Konami doing their best effort to bring duel monsters to life, it was clear, it was evident that by Volume 2, the physical game needed more depth than what it was currently providing. As it was, the only viable strategy was drawing into strong monsters and punch. Enter the official guide starter book on May 6, 1999. In a similar function to the starter box, this written work was a useful resource to learn how to play the game. It also featured tips and tricks and even a Q&A. More importantly, it completely rewrote the rules of play in what is called the expert rules. This rule set is like what we know Yu-Gi-Oh! To be, with tributes and no backer activation or set limits. The sacrifice summon, as satanic as it sounds, gave more importance to the monster's star rating, as now instead of assign a rarity, it signifies how many monsters need to be tributed to summon the specific monster. So the mid-class monsters in levels 5 and 6 need 1 tribute, whereas high-class level 7 and up monsters need 2 tributes. Another change was with fusion materials. Now you can fuse with monsters both on field and in hand, which was a big improvement to the fusion strategy. Previously, you had to rely on Swords of Revealing Light to build your field up. Plus, if you bought the starter book, then you received a promotional Flame Swordsman card with the first alternate art in the game, incentive for the collector or fans of the casual strategy. The expert rules affected the game in a multitude of ways. It makes powerful monsters in check, like the unparalleled Blue Eyes White Dragon, and it improves the viability of low-class monsters. In a more outward way, this allowed duelists who didn't have a deck filled with high rarity cards the ability to run lower rarity cards and still keep an edge in the game. Unlimiting back row card usage gave way to combos, which was otherwise impossible, and that's kind of funny to say. Now you can activate Raigeki and use Monster Reborn for a devastating direct attack. Hey, I didn't say they'd be complicated combos. This was a surprising change that led to more nuanced deck construction. Now, all those high-level cards can be stuck in your hand should you lack proper tributes, so cramming all the new strong beaters in your deck was a surefire way to lose. The new logic was to shift towards low-class cards and find the right opportunity to summon bigger threats. In turn, this made equipped decks better since monsters were now weaker on average, even if equipped decks were still a tough sell. The official rules were still around, but were seen as secondary, kept for beginner players to learn the game at a ground level. All that said, it was clear that the expert rules were put in place to make the game more strategic and overall interesting, especially with the future in mind. With a new rule set, the Volume 2 meta would certainly morph into a new environment. For one, Curse of Dragon received a huge boost for being the only one tribute monster, and thus being able to be brought out easier than his seniors. For that matter, Gaia dropped off the face of the earth, since if you were to play any of these, Gaia is by far the weakest, and even Dark Magician would only be used if you were hard pressed on playing more tribute monsters than the 3 Blue Eyes. This is to say that you'd still need heavy hitters considering walls are still very much popular, and more so now since Curse can't beat over them, and they provide a stall tactic to tribute over. So you could consider Fissure to be a direct counter to these cards moving forward. Keep in mind that Swords of Revealing Light can now stall you to build up tribute fodder too. Also, Reborn can revive monsters simply to be tributed, which gives you more options to play than ever before. The meta was still good stuff oriented, but in ways of low level beats instead of high level beats. Do keep in mind that while you could construct a bougie build, it's not like everyone had access to Kanan, the starter box theatrical release, or the Celtic Guardian pre-order bonus, so a more accurate build would look fairly different. This leads us to the meat and potatoes in the second installment in the Booster series, aptly titled Booster 2, released on May 25th, 1999. Similarly to Booster 1, this set didn't include a whole ton of cards, but what it did present moved the game in a positive direction. One aspect was a new injection of mid-class monsters. While all 4 are weaker than Curse, yes, the relative high stats for one tribute could still be of use. They were of lower rarity too, which made them easily obtainable strong monsters, assuming you could pull them from the card-ass machine, with the best of them being Giant Mech Soldier. And even still, GMS was generally better as a side deck card if you wanted to have your Curse of Dragon avoid a possible sided Dragon Capture jar. In terms of low-class monsters, Rogue Doll pushed the boundaries with its 1600 attack stat. There was also Giant Flea with a matching offensive power to Uraby. Bean Soldier was also released here that had a comparable 1400 attack stat, which matched Celtic Guardian. This set a new standard for this class, so now you could throw away those bats and bone mice. But keep Majiris light, he looks badass. To match these, B2 introduced attribute-specific equip magic that gave a 400 attack buff with a 200 defense decrease. Losing defensive strength did hurt some previous equipped strategies, but the offensive pressure gained outweighed that sentiment, since it gave a considerably large boost and was more general to fit in decks, therefore asking less from the player. These resolved prior issues and made the equip strategy significantly better, because now any mid-class monster with a proper equip card can beat over a wall. Speaking of equipped decks, all the new cards gave the deck new life that made it a top tier strategy. Roguedoll with Elf's Light can match Curse's attack, which makes the dragon a not as safe option, let alone equipping a Blue Eyes with the light to make a fearsome 3400 attacking white dragon. Invigoration was better in some ways for its versatility of targets. So for deck building, you could go towards a light equip build, or an earth equip build, or even a mix for a heaven and earth deck. Essentially, they turned low-level monsters into mid-level monsters. Hell, you could even use Sword of Dark Destruction to emphasize Curse's usage. Another thing in the equip strategy's favor is that you get immediate firepower and no loss in resources, as opposed to losing a monster to summon a stronger monster. Compare this to good stuff where they may have unusable higher level monsters in hand and thus be at a disadvantage. Although equips can have the same issue where you need the right pieces to make it work, and if a monster is destroyed, then you lose 2 cards. Given the small card pool, Booster 2 did a surprising amount of positive sway in the game. It fixed the equip strategy and gave good stuff a run for their money. All this, in addition to the expert rules, helped bolster an era where deck building was truly born. It is fair to argue that the game wasn't that much more complex. However, the game was still in its infancy, so no one should expect anything too meta-warping. It's at least nice to see that Konami, for pushing equips for so long, had to pivot their strategy to make something of it work out. And the other cards themselves still had cool art if you were more into the collecting scene, with plenty that have yet to make their way into the West. Even cards like Dark Piercing Light and Ukazi would find use in some way in the future. If Konami wanted to spice the game up, you really can't get more fascinating than the Booster 2 period. But with a new volume comes new surprises, so will Konami be able to keep up the momentum, or will they falter? Let's find out only a few days later on May 27, 1999. Volume 3 is quite a groundbreaking set with its 50-card lineup. Firstly, even though it was right after B2, V3 included reprints of relevant cards like Roguedoll and Giant Mech Soldier. Remember, B2 was from those card-ass vending machines, which meant obtaining some of these powerful cards was harder, and thus having a core set release meant you could now update your decks easier. V3 also gave us the first secret rare in Gaia the Dragon Champion. While Fusion still had inherent issues, Gaia bolstered a sturdy attack stat, and given most duels were running Curse of Dragon and 1 to 2 Blue Eyes, it wasn't out of the question that you could, in theory, run a dedicated Gaia deck, and thus the real first Fusion deck was born. There were some interesting cards too, like Gravedigger Ghoul that introduces the concept of banish cards, ooh. And straight from the manga, we have Red Eye's Black Dragon, yeah, about time. Unfortunately, this was the expert rules era, and as such, Red Eyes didn't see much interest beyond collectors. It was a little bit too late. The real focus on V3 was most definitely on the introduction of effect monsters. These darkened monsters are like a mix of monsters and back row cards. While they lack solid stats and take a turn to activate their effects, they still contain generally decent effects. What we know this freshman lineup to be flip effect monsters, back then the term didn't exist. Rather, the card simply stated, quote, "When the monster is flipped, face up," unquote. This would be the case until Series 2, but for confusion's sake, I'll refer to them as their specified forms. Either the case, all of a sudden, you have new criteria for card evaluation as opposed to pure punching weight as seen before. After all, a set monster could now essentially contain a trap. And with walled monsters still abundant, you as a player have a choice on what to set, and the opponent an option on what and how to attack. Let's take Maneater Bug as a prime example, as a monster that both duelists need to play around. It could destroy a monster on the field, which would severely punish those playing tribute monsters or using the equip strategy. Hane, while weaker than Bug, was also great for these reasons and possibly more of a side deck option. Skelangel could offset card loss or gain you advantage should you be able to make use of it post-effect like for a tribute summon. Arm Ninja was only there for equip and field decks since, remember, Swords of Revealing Light does not stay on the field at this time, which for that matter made him significantly less useful than Bug or Hane, which could get rid of the monster threat itself. Lastly, there's the first normal rare card in the game, which is a short print rare. Reaper of the cards. Reaper stood out to people for its unique stats, 1380, 1930. When reading the digits using Japanese kunyomi and onyomi pronunciations for attack and defense respectively, it roughly translates to, quote, "You are going to a secret mountain," unquote, which is a reference to Japanese folklore where death gods lead people to mountains to die. Yikes. His effect otherwise lets you deal with Trap Hole primarily, but being a mid-level monster makes it hard to play. Interestingly, the new fusion Barox, which Panic plays in the manga, also contains unorthodox stats. I can't find anything on what his name should be translated to, but from my own translation, it could roughly mean Child of the Secret Mountain or Last Child of the Secret Mountain, which would fit his demonic appearance as a denizen who was once brought into the Shinigami's domain. Going back to the flips, they were questioned at the time. Are they too slow and unreliable when compared to equip magic? Keep in mind, while new, plenty of flip hate exists. Dark Hole and Raigeki destroy them without their flip effects activating. Swords of Revealing Light could protect your own flips, and it would force flip and effect activation, which could be beneficial if your opponent had a bug or Hane and was forced to target one of their own monsters. And then Dark Piercing Light gained usage for being a budget-friendly version of swords. There was also Stop Defense that could force a single face-down monster into face-up attack position. This had additional singular usage since Fissure cannot target a set. Plus, Stop could also hit face-up monsters, in which both flips and walls had rather low attack stats. Technically speaking, Stop does nothing, so you need to plan to have a follow-up attack beforehand. It's a card for more tactical duelists. On the wall side, we got Giant Soldier of Stone, which has a 2k defense, the comparable 1300 punch, a card that was easier to obtain and better than Aquamador. And with Invigoration, 1700 attack wasn't anything to scoff at. Though when it comes to individual monsters, Rogue Doll reprint aside, Skull Red Bird is the new flair here. Woo! 1550 attack meant this winged beast could beat over any of the rising 1500 stars like Urabi and Giant Flea, so your top two fighters were in a class of their own. Although the single standout card in V3 had to be the magic card, Pot of Greed. What's there to be said about it? Draw 2 cards. It's a free advantage in an era where advantage was rare. And don't forget, every card is currently unlimited at 3 copies. An extra card in hand is no joke, and unlike Magic the Gathering, the draw was free, so literally any deck could run it, which in turn made duels that much quicker. Equipped decks certainly enjoyed this since they couldn't make much use out of flips compared to good stuff. Even though it was a common, there was still a chance you wouldn't pull this card. Thankfully, it was around this time when stores started to sell singles more frequently than before, where it was a small corner in the store selling products. Something interesting, the original print includes self-destruction text, which was odd considering that it was for trap cards. Perhaps at one point in development, Pot was intended to be a trap to balance it out. This is not to say that the set was full of roses. While hierarchy of cards have inherently existed, like with, say, Tomasaurus, Sandstone may be the first meme card, as it was the first truly bad tribute monster. 1300, 1600 for one tribute is just bizarre when considering Giant Soldier of Stone was released in the same set. It's the first time duelists could actively see Konami creating filler cards, much like whatever this weak leg card is. Alongside various new fusions, we also received Rare Fish, a unique fusion that needs a fusion monster as material. What? Yeah, you need Enchanting Mermaid, Petite Angel, Mystical Sheep number 2, Fusionist, and 2 polymerizations for a monster with a middling 1500 attack stat. Oof. It could have had interesting implications had Konami gone in this direction of fusing fusion monsters into bigger threats. But alas, we just have this fish. Perhaps that's why Fusionist was called what it was, to be a fusion conduit. The meta would also contain the June 1999 limited edition 1 packs. These were 3 packs that contained 3 cards each, available by mail order from Weekly Shonen Jump magazine. The cards were previously Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters in-game promo cards, so veteran duelists may already have a connection to these, cards that the Western audience may remember from the McDonald's pack. Most of the cards were duds though. Millennium Shield did have some fringe uses as the strongest defender in the game, blocking even Blue Eyes, but it was a prime target for Fissure or a counterattack with stop defense. Takraminos and Fairy's Gift had solid attack stats, with them fitting into a pure beatdown or the water equipped deck and the Yami deck respectively. But that was it for Limited Edition 1. The Volume 3 format of Yu-Gi-Oh! OCG was another interesting time for the game. It still has some regional exclusive, with the bulk of the cards being reminiscent of early 2002 TCG. Give us Wandering Doomed already! Oddly enough, it was a pivot from the equip-centric focus on V2, whereas V3 seemed to have either taken a step back in favor of monster effects, or they were obligated to finish the type-specific equip cards. Because, like I alluded to earlier, equip decks weren't, well, equipped to handle flips very well, nor did they have the proper deck space to make use of their utility. The Good Stuff lower axis deck got the extra buff in an era that added more combo potential and thought-provoking gameplay. The game state was to gain advantage with low-class monsters until you could make a decisive blow with a tribute monster, or rather mid-class due to Bug and Hane now being around and deterring high-class builds. Even when looking at the beater options, they did have a variety of attributes, which made aesthetic variety a meta option when compared to attribute-based equip decks. This is to say, deck construction in general did increase, even if it was more rogue options. It certainly did feel like a new volume in Yu-Gi-Oh! Was opened, and if the direction of effects is continued, then who knows where it'll take the game next. Seriously, what's up with that leg card? It's kinda sexy. As we enter July, the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Certainly feels real, as Duelists received in the mail invitations for the upcoming Duelist Legend in Tokyo Dome tournament. The event would be held in late August, so this gave Duelists plenty of time to involve themselves in the game. One such involvement was that the tournament rules included the first ever limited list, where you could only have one copy of the following cards per deck: Dark Hole, Raigeki, and Trap Hole. Hitting the back row staples was no joke, as now monster removal was severely, well, limited, aside from Fissure. And this event would be played via the card game, unlike the national tournament back in February. Although the confusing part was that it was unclear if this list was specifically for the tournament or if it was a widespread rule moving forward. However, Duelists still played with the Phantom list in July to, at the very least, prepare for the event. So from here on out, I will be using the July list in deck construction. Also in early July was the second booster set in Booster 3, more gacha games, yay. This was a big set, for it included the first effect monsters that didn't need to be flipped for their effects to activate. The main one people glanced at was Hourglass of Courage, that starts with half attack and can double its attack during your following turn's end phase for a strong 2200 attack, a stat that can beat Curse of Dragon and Giant Soldier of Stone. While its effect is alluring, it ultimately left a lot to be desired. Surviving one turn was difficult enough, aside from Swords of Revealing Light, but it's still an investment when compared to general beaters, let alone the fact that Hourglass needs to wait multiple turns to actually see use. It's a high-risk type of card that was more of a joke than actually useful. And that was the best of the bunch. Your good effect monsters were still Maneater Bug, Skellangel, and Hane. Solid monsters otherwise were Great White and Beautiful Headhuntress. These two, alongside Rogue Doll, changed the baseline low axis beater stat to 1600. While Mystic Clown was released here too with a generally decent 1500 attack stat, it was just barely late to the party. 1500 beaters just weren't as viable anymore now that you have 9 options unless you were geared toward a specific equip strategy. Not even mentioning that if you were hard-pressed for a few more beaters, Skull Red Bird existed, in which technically the mountain strategy gained strength with Takuhi, which could get up to 1650, and Curse could get buffed too. In that same regard, Beautiful Headhuntress and Giant Flea / Great White and Takraminos had Invigoration and Steel Shell synergy respectively, but I digress. Booster 3 was also known for its large number of new traps. Reverse Trap was to counter the equip strategy as it changed the stat gains. This would be good if not for 3 reasons. 1 being that the 1600 beatdown build was becoming popular. 2, low axis and flip axis decks were becoming one homogenized entity, and as such, equipped decks still had a tough time with the bug being a certified staple at this point. And 3, a new powerful trap card arrived called Reinforcements, or should I use its Japanese name, Reinforcements of the Army? This trap gave any monster a 500 attack boost for a turn, which meant that weaker monsters like Stone can beat over Doll, and Doll can beat over Curse. This can be used with any monster at the time, barring the initial set. Castle walls? Nah, you were looking for reinforcements from the card-ass machines. Last but not least from the power cards of Booster 3 was Ultimate's Offering, or known in the OCG as Price of Blood. Pay 500 life points to normal summon an additional monster, an effect that was probably designed to make tribute summoning easier. Us TCG folk may be familiar with it and its confusing rulings. I've made a video on its OCG absurdity in the past, but going over it again, like many card effects at the time, the OCG text was ambiguous. Some people in some regions thought you could normal summon high-class monsters by paying 500. Some places even thought fusions met this criteria too. Gaia, anyone? Remember, in 1999, the internet wasn't that widespread. It wasn't uncommon for even books to include misinformation. What is there to judge a ruling on? Cards like Fissure hitting face-down cards or Raigeki hitting all monsters in the deck are some examples of this ambiguity. As such, certain areas in Japan saw way more play with Yugioh than others. One deck to summon another Rogue Doll versus a deck to summon a Blue Eyes from hand is not the same ideology at all. One last fun bit of trivia is the new card Jormungand. Despite looking like a water monster, it is based on a sea serpent in Norse mythology called Jormungandr that encircled the earth, and thus it's an earth monster. The more you know. The format was not defined by a singular set, as only a few days later, on July 8th, we saw the release of Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monster 2, Dark Duel Stories. Each copy of this game contained 3 of 10 promotional cards. Since these were random and the game was pricey as is, you most likely need to get the singular cards at card shops, in which they tended to be pricier than others. And you should pay the relatively high price, since some of these cards are indeed powerful. The strongest of the bunch was Kunai with Chain. It has shades of reinforcements with the additional effect of changing an attack monster into defense position, in which many beaters had low defense. Once again, we had a trap that threw away the idea of attribute-specific builds over general attack boosts. It also gave you the element of surprise, and now the opponent is more wary of what lurks beneath. Another notable card is Crush Card Virus. Yeah, it was released this early. While its widespread powerful monster removal is nothing to scoff at, the game at this point lacked any playable weak dark monsters. Remember, this wasn't Booster 1 with Ryukushin anymore. Some card pool drawbacks was with the new Harpy's Feather Duster, a Raigeki for the back row. Trap Hole was just Phantom Limited, so the only real targets were the Gotcha Machine reinforcements, the rare to see Kunai, and Swords of Revealing Light didn't stay on the field. As such, Virus and Duster didn't see much play on release. Then we have Perfectly Ultimate Great Moth, yeah, before the original. The first monster with a special summon clause barring fusion summoning. This card was hard to summon. Impossible even, considering neither Cocoon nor Petite Moth existed. If you didn't know the manga, you'd be very confused. But if you're in the area where Price of Blood decks existed at max capacity, then Moth would be perfect as a monster to summon with Yugioh, since Yugioh mentions that you can summon separately from normal summons, and since Moth has no way to summon it otherwise, Yugioh makes it so that it can be summoned. Scary Terry. Speaking of unusable cards, Cyber Shield can only be equipped to the non-existent Harpy's Lady or Harpy's Lady's sisters. What even? There would be more equip magic that pushed the boundaries to what even the attribute-based ones could do. Insect Armor with Laser Cannon, Salamandra, and Shine Palace all increase attack by 700 points. This was great in comparison, if not limited by select types and attributes in the current climate. Shine Palace was the best of the bunch due to Rogue Doll, or even in the Yugioh environment with a Light Blood deck with Blue Eyes and the new promo Seiryu. The last promo is Acid Trap Hole, which takes care of wall monsters, an issue that Kunai with 1600s were already solving. Technically speaking, there were 2 game guides for Dark Duel stories that included promos, but they were these 2 weird ARM cards that have no use aside from a crush card target. The card pool added a lot of new, useful cards, and deck construction was amplified by the limited list. With just 3 cards hit, you now had 6 free slots for deck construction, so theoretically equip/field decks could make space for rogue play. I say rogue since reinforcements and kunai both made the once alternate strategy more of an uphill climb to play, especially with Duster now existing. The combination of flips and beaters were clearly top dog, and as such, it created the umbrella concept of good stuff. Otherwise, you had the kind of not legal blood price of the highest order deck, which created an entirely different metagame depending on where you lived. Yugioh wouldn't get an official clarity until the EX starter box rulebook in December. Booster 3 and the Dark Duel Story promo cards all contain randomist pickup cards and rely more on card shops. On top of that, cards like Yugioh, Moth, and Cyber Shield did nothing but confuse people. I'm sure printing more equip-focused cards such as Reverse Trap and Salamandra made duelists question what Konami truly wanted to push, equips or beaters, because it seemed to be both, with one side clearly being more consistent than the other, especially as more cards get printed. All that said, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was ultimately more interactive, and you can see this period as where strategies really took place. With all the gears moving at this point and the big tournament coming up, will Konami continue this push, or will they ease into the coming months? As we move on to July 22nd, 1999, the next core booster is released, Volume 4. Don't get too excited from Pegasus on the cover, as his tunes are not in this set. This may be a surprise to some of you, considering that the last release, the DDS promos, included Shine Palace, a card that Pegasus used and features Toon World in its art. Then again, it's not the first time Konami did this. Looking at you, Volume 1 with Blue Eyes on the cover. What should have been on the cover is V4's chase card, Summon Skull. At this point in time, effect monsters were slowly growing over normal monsters due to their boundless ceiling of potential effects. What would normals do? Keep getting stronger and stronger, and then what? This was the issue coming into play with the official rules. The tribute mechanic did slow things down, but it was effects that changed card philosophy. For that matter, tributes were only becoming worse as no one wanted to play high-class mons aside from a singleton copy of Blue Eyes. Mid-class were defined by either Curse of Dragon, which was average at best, or Giant Mech Soldier, which was more of a side deck card against Dragon Capture Jar. And then in Volume 4, yeah, this video, came along Summon Skull. Only a single tribute for a monster with 2500 attack. That's a stat equaling Dark Magician. While its defense stat is rather tiny, this was a blessing in disguise, as it was probably the reason Skull was a level 6 in the first place. But who cares? One tribute for such a high attack is nothing short of exceptional. Despite it being lower than Blue Eyes' 3k attack, 25 was much greater than Curse. More importantly, it could beat over walls with no issue, something Curse could only tie with. This was huge, as now it meant in the face of Skull, walls acting as defenders was essentially useless. Though walls still had an important purpose, to act as tribute fodder for Skull. Keep in mind that low-level mons still had trouble beating over 2k defense, which made walls primed to keep around for a turn to tribute over. In that regard, you want to get rid of opposing walls ASAP. A tricky task, as that set could be a man-eater bug. So do you attack or leave the face down on the field? Skull affected the game more than just being a big beat stick. It made face downs more threatening by proxy, made walls a double-edged sword, phased out both Curse and Blue Eyes, the White Dragon would still see play in Price of Blood areas, and made reinforcements that much weaker since Kunai with Chain was the only battle trap that could let low-level mons beat Skull. And aside from Skull, all the new tribute mons were nothing short of being weak, further emphasizing Skull's weight class. Thankfully, V4 had more than just beaters. It had Magician of Faith too. While weak, this effect mod has a great salvage effect to return any of your used magic cards back to your hand. Don't forget that due to the July Phantom list, Dark Hole and Raigeki were at 1 copy, so now you could use those cards multiple times per duel. For the most part, the main target would be Pot of Greed since it was an immediate advantage, unlike Dark Hole or Feather Duster. This gave more prominence to the idea of card advantage. Really, the only downside was setting it without Magic Engrave, though considering Pot was at 3, there was a high chance Faith would always be active. On the flip side, we also got Mask of Darkness. It's Faith that can recur a trap card instead. Even though there are less great traps compared to Magic, you still have solid targets like Trap Hole and Kunai. In addition, it was also the perfect monster for Crush Card Virus if you wanted to go more towards a viral deck. All in all, Mask was more of a tactical choice. Odd though that V4 didn't add any new traps to pair with this card. The other big release in V4 were the Tribal Removal cards. This is specific field-wide removal for the following types: Machine, Rock, Insect, Fish, and Warrior. Given tribal decks aren't popular, you had to decide which removal to play, could potentially hit your own monsters, and it doesn't hit face-down cards. General removal was more than enough. Otherwise, we did get a chunk of cards worth mentioning. Petite Moth and Cocoon of Evolution gave a proper summoning condition for Moth, but 6 turns was asking for way too much when Skull only took 2 turns, barring Reborn plays. At the very least, Cocoon was a wall if you needed more of them. The new Harpy Lady Sisters, and Elegant Egotist allowed for a Harpy strategy, and for Cyber Shield to finally be played. Sadly, the deck just doesn't have enough firepower, and too many cards to make the concept work at this stage. Low-level beaters remain the same, just with new 1500s. Armored Lizard, Destroyer Golem, Ground Attacker Bugroth, and Kojikosi, all Earth monsters funnily enough. I wonder why Konami didn't want to release more 1600s, or more of the 700 buff equips for that matter. Effect-wise, the only other 2 we got were Electric Lizard and Steel Scorpion that could technically get you some value in this format if they were your only options. Lastly, there was another mystery limb released. Last episode, I discussed the DDS game guides in which the second one would be released on August 10th, making the limbs amount to 4. Weird, but alright. Taking a quick jump from V4, we go to August 20th for the last addition to this current format, the Valuable Book 1. The Valuable Book is a long-running card encyclopedia, a strategy book, if you will. They usually contain promo cards such as VB1 with Dokuro Rider and Revival of Dokuro Rider. What is this blue card? This is a main deck ritual monster that requires the mon in hand, the ritual magic to perform the summon, and the magic needs you to have enough monsters to match or exceed the level of the blue card. To note, the ritual magic, with icons not existing yet, is specified as a ritual class of magic cards. The new summoning mechanic is similar to fusions. You need at least 3 cards to perform the summon, many of which are inherent bricks. In that same vein, the cost is not worth the reward, as Dokuro Rider has a measly 1900-1850 stats with 6 stars, meaning you need to tribute a chunk of monsters or stronger monsters for this guy who can't even beat over a wall. You should have been a level 4 so you could convert a normal beater into a relatively stronger one. At least then you can make use of its special summon. Rituals may be a new type of card, and even still, they're just a blue colored fusion monster. It was a card that people talked about, but no one actually played. Perhaps in the Price of Blood areas, some people may have believed this could be summoned off of that as well, which in that case it would be even worse in the face of stronger mods. Better to leave the Skull Rider to ride off in the sunset. Volume 4 is a curious set. It pushed away all other high-level monsters in the wake of Skull. This also gave way for people running Hain and Stop Defense more frequently. The set, while changing a lot, introduced little in ways of power cards. It was just Skull and Faith, with some people looking at Mask and the Tribal Removal. That is, unless you only bought the set for Water Emotics, I wouldn't blame you. Decks funneled down to just good stuff, with the Virus decks as a possibility. Card by card, it felt more like a booster set. Nevertheless, it spoke greater with fewer words, as gameplay mentality did change from before and opened the duel's eyes to what could be. With that in mind, this was certainly a new volume in the Book of Duel Monsters. A relatively normal environment until people set fire to the proverbial library. On August 26, 1999, a riot of 65,000 people broke out at one of Japan's largest stadiums over a small set of Yu-Gi-Oh cards. But how and why did the game's first OCG tournament wind up like this? But our journey takes us a couple videos back to Booster 3, where I discuss the invitations to the upcoming Yu-Gi-Oh tournament, Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters, Duelist Legend in Tokyo Dome on August 26. This was big, as it would be the first ever OCG national tournament, whereas the event brought up in my Booster 1 video was purely for the DM1 video game. And this was at the Tokyo Dome, one of Japan's largest stadiums, hosting icons like Michael Jackson and Kenny Omega. If you submitted your Shonen Jump invitation request, you'd receive special invitation cards, which surely made you feel like you're about to enter the Duelist Kingdom. So whether you're going for the OCG or the parallel DM2 tournament, it was clear that the Duelist Legend was going to be something worth remembering. And boy howdy, was it. Before the event took place, it was announced that a special pack would be for sale there, Premium Pack, a luxurious sounding pack which was amplified due to the nature that you could only get it at the Dome, and if you didn't, it would be gone forever. Initially, it was specified that it would be only for sale for those who entered the DM2 tournament side. However, at some point, this rule was changed to anyone who brought a copy of Shonen Jump magazine. If you don't know, that's one of the most widely circulated publications in all of Japan. So now, pretty much anyone who came could purchase these limited cards. Then the fateful day arrived. Weather, low 77, high 88, 0% precipitation. Konami originally estimated a turnout of 40,000 people, but by the time of the event, 55,000 people showed up in droves. Turned out that the advertising of the premium pack was so successful that a majority of people who arrived came just to buy the pack. Yeah, tens of thousands of people there to buy a single product sounds like a hamburger recipe for disaster. And I should note that there were 55,000 people inside. There were another 10,000 people left outside, unable to enter due to entry restrictions. Remember how the sale was originally for the select duelists who entered the DM2 side? Well, apparently Konami never updated their sales strategy to compensate for the influx of potential buyers. The amount of packs Konami produced was finite, and what's more is that there was only a single sale space located outside in the hot sun. All the while, young duelists were heading indoors and collecting their entry bonus cards, Gate Guardian and Magician of Black Chaos. These two cards were awesome for fans of the manga, albeit impossible to summon at the time, barring UO regions. For that matter, Gate Guardian would be rather competent, something I've discussed before. It does have to be mentioned that right before the qualifying round, there was a ruling that cleared up how Ultimate Offering is supposed to work, so no moth shenanigans. As the day progressed through the morning and into the afternoon, the sun only grew hotter like an infernal flame emperor. But for the duelists, the qualifying rounds progressed. For those who passed the first round qualifier, they would receive a single copy of Sengenjin. This Millennium primitive man had fair enough stats for a 2 tribute monster, overpowering Dark Magician, yet fairly weaker than Blue Eyes. Second round finalists would receive a copy of Serpent Knight Dragon, which is considerably weaker than Sengenjin, making me feel like the two cards should have been swapped as prizes. Outside the tournament, a different storm was brewing. As soon as sales began, the collection of sweaty card enthusiasts swarmed the booth, dissipating any semblance of an organized line. You could not move in this sea of nerds, as clearly Konami underestimated the fanbase's tenacity. I mean, what was even in this premium pack? The set contained 10 unique cards, with mostly terrible cards like Dharma Cannon and Dancing Elf. Even the 2 tribute monsters were weak in regards to the meta, with Cosmo Queen being at least stronger than the first round qualifier prize, even if 2 tribute good stuff builds in general were phased out. There would also be 2 effect monsters in Goddess of Whim and Time Wizard. Whim was interesting as it was a newly introduced random coin toss effect that could potentially bump its attack stat up to 1900 for the turn. But since it was random and could potentially backfire, having its attack instead, it was no more useful than Hourglass of Courage, which was deemed bad. Likewise, you have Time Wizard, of whom also contained a coin toss effect. If you call the toss right, you can Raigeki your opponent's board. However, if you miss, you Raigeki your own board and take some burn damage. Wizard was more fun than Whim, sure, and even still, it was hard to suggest with such a random effect. Though everyone clearly wanted a single card from Premium Pack, Exodia, the Forbidden One. Any fans of the manga knew of this card, and the hype built up from 4 previous releases. If you have this card and the 4 limbs in your hand at the same time, you win the duel. A wholly new win condition for a deck, which was mentioned in the starter guide, was worth the price of admission. People knew what was coming, and boy were they ready for it. Could you imagine if the TCG introduced Exodia in this way? But here's the funny thing. Not only was obtaining every Exodia piece difficult given their scarcity and timeline of releases, the cards in each pack were randomized, meaning if you bought one, there was a chance you wouldn't even pull Exodia nor the secret rare Time Wizard. Quite possibly, you could wait and miss the chaos and end up purchasing Mikazuka no Yaiba, Meteor Dragon, and Tour Purin. Although, at the very least, they allowed you to buy up to 5 packs. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has already been putting powerful cards in hard-to-obtain places like Aquamador, Kanan, and Kunai, so it wasn't surprising that the set featuring the final needed piece of Exodia was at the event. So now you know why people were filling in the sales area like boiling water in a kettle. Again, I repeat myself, this was 10,000 people outside waiting for their opportunity to buy the pack. Imagine stuffing thousands of Kaibas in a single location. This was an invasion of chaos, and by the mid-afternoon, the sales were postponed for 2 hours so Konami employees could try to contain the masses and get the products needed. People waited in the blistering heat for this grueling 2 hours, only to be met by Konami's response. Given the unmatchable demand and the threatening uproar was seemingly unquenchable, the sales of Premium Pack was cancelled altogether. Rightfully so, this made attendees furious. With so many people waiting for hours in the heat, it makes for one explosive cocktail. The commotion quickly turned into a riot, with thousands of people protesting and shouting at employees, others of their mindset, and even the clouds, had there been any. As any justified response, Konami called in the troops. No, not the Goblin Attack Force, rather the Riot Squad. According to an article in the LA Times, the deputy police chief stated he's never seen such an outcry. Yeah, the event was so big that news outlets outside Japan covered the story. Even places like the USA, which didn't receive the card game for another 3 years. What was surprising, aside from adults writing over a children's card game, was that Japan is a culture typically consisting of rule followers. So the fact that the riot police arrived and the people were still protesting surely makes this one of the most embarrassing incidents in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! That is, until the police beat the shit out of 2 people. I would say Americans are better, but Black Friday. We're all just crazy humans. Due to the riot, the tournament was rightfully cancelled midway through, to be postponed for a later date. That would be on December 5th, although we don't know if the card pool was frozen or if duelists would be able to play with newer releases. To make up for the pack cancellation, they were made available later on via mail orders to attendees who had to show proof of their participation. If you were to find some of the cards at your local card shop, the aftermarket prices would have been extraordinary, with the likes of Time Wizard going for 100,000 yen or $637 USD. To be fair, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was already viewed as a pricey game. The tournament would eventually be split up as regional qualifiers, with copies of Trihorn Dragon given to the finalists. This unworthy dragon would still be a tall ass to play, and yet it was at least stronger than Cosmo Queen. For the winners of the whole shebang, the top 3 would receive copies of Firewing Pegasus, a 1-tribute monster that was weaker than Summon Skull, but stronger than Curse of Dragon. I'm honestly surprised Konami didn't give us a monster with similar stats to this before Skull. Top 2 would receive copies of Meteor Black Dragon, a powerful fusion monster that puts Gaia the Dragon Champion to shame. Almost in ironic fashion, you needed the Premium Pack's Meteor Dragon for one of this card's fusion materials. And for the first place winner, a single copy of the notable Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon was given out. This is the ultimate fusion monster, eclipsing Meteor by 1,000 4,000 attack points. Not even Gate Guardian nor Ultimate Great Moth could reach the 4,000 barrier. The top two prices were only amplified by the two fusions' climactic inclusion in the 1999 Yu-Gi-Oh movie by Toei. Technically speaking, Ultimate was Blue Eyes White Dragon's 3-body connection, but all's the same. In regards to deck building, all the cards featured at the Duelist Legend tournament were incredibly difficult to obtain, especially the top 3 prize cards, and thus not feasible to include for future deck builds. Since it was so early in Yu-Gi-Oh's lifespan and given the nature of the event, no deck lists exist. However, we do know that Booster 4, which was released on the same day as said event, would not be legal at this time. Also important is that in the valuable Book 1, D-Spell was mentioned to deal with Swords of Revealing Light, and by the Tokyo Dome, it was ruled that Swords now does in fact stay on field. In the 1990s, trading card games took the world by storm, but on August 26, 1999, Yu-Gi-Oh! Took Japan in a malevolent tempest. What was set to be the first large-scale OCG tournament went out with a bang, and not the one Konami was expecting. Despite Konami attempting to remedy the solution in a variety of ways, the damage was already dealt. People would not listen. And August 26, 1999 went down as one of, if not the most infamous day in Yu-Gi-Oh! History. All this over a pack that may have gotten the buyer a Frog the Jam. It was a splotch on the game's history, but it did not mark the end of times, because on that same day, August 26, 1999, the next booster set was released. Booster 4. Once the dust had settled and people got over not receiving their Frog the Jams, the Yu-Gi-Oh! Fans realized what they should have gotten excited over all this time. To preface it, B4 made the Tokyo Dome a distant memory. The power of low-level cards entered a new age entirely. Axe Raider is immediately stronger than Rogue Doll, being a result of the game's natural progression. This would have been normal if it hadn't been for a few more new beaters. Lojin, the Mystical Genie of the Lamp, and Giant Red Sea Snake are one step ahead of the curve with their 1800 attack stats. Suddenly, not only Rogue Doll and their 1600 kin were outdated, but so were a good chunk of the mid-level monsters too. For that matter, the addition of these 3 monsters dissipated the concept of sub-2000 mid-mons. I know what you're thinking. Axe Raider once again got screwed out of meta viability. He got the axe. And even that wasn't enough for B4 to bolster the card pool with, for Konami decided to pull a Super Saiyan 2 and introduce Mechanical Chaser with a whopping 1850 attack. It's only 50 higher than Law Jin, but Chaser can beat it nonetheless. Even if B4 introduced just Axe Raider and Law Jin, Rogue Doll would still be somewhat playable, but now with the 2 new additional 1800 attackers and an 1851, Rogue Doll was left in the dust. And the funny thing is that Chaser wasn't even the strongest low-level beater in the set. Konami went even further beyond with Gemini Elf, a 4-star 1900 attack spellcaster. It's not even close. This was the new low-level boss monster. It was only 100 points less than Curse of Dragon. Quite frankly, it set the bar and branded it. Even by today's standards, is it rare to see a vanilla with 2k attack, making 1900 that gold standard of what it means to be a normal beater, which makes it that much weirder that Elf was released only a few months into the game, in the same set that was already breaking attack potency boundaries. The power creep throughout this early period has been by the hundreds, but now it was by 300. We were starting to see power inflation with the official rules, but the expert rules just said, hold my beer. Keep in mind the time period. Nothing was set in stone when it came to the stat ceiling. For all the duelists knew, there could be a time when a 4-star monster would reach Summon Skull territory, or dare you even mention Blue Eyes. Thankfully that never happened, but what if? I'm unsure why Konami felt the need to make this move at this point in time. They could have just released Axe Raider and Law Jin and called it a day. While having no effect, Gemini Elf shook the game more than Premium Pack ever could. Do you know what's even wilder? B4 had more power cards than just the beaters. Enter Graceful Charity, a magic card that lets you draw 3, then discard 2. In many ways, it's better than Pot of Greed, for it allows you to dig through your deck more and reshape your hand, possibly even setting up Monster Reborn plays like with Blue Eyes. One thing to remember is that at the time, there were no resurrection restrictions, meaning you could dump and revive a perfectly ultimate Great Moth. Regardless of which draw you think is better, it's up there for the best draw cards in the game's history. And that's really all the cards you wanted from B4. Sure, there were other interesting cards, such as White Hole and Call of the Grave, which negate Dark Hole and Monster Reborn respectively, a reasonable yet poor way to deal with the power cards. He also had new effect monsters in Cockroach Knight, Karakuri Spider, Swordsman from a Distant Land, the Wicked Worm Beast, and Zone Eater, but nothing too notable, save for Worm Beast when it comes to some rogue strategy in early TCG. We're a far cry from the days of old, where cards like Faithbird, Dark Titan of Terror, or Big Insect may have seen play. I mean, B4 introduced a line of mid-level 1800 monsters that maybe would have seen some experimentation had Summon Skull not come out in Volume 4. And even still, we got Turtle Bird, which just slightly outclassed even the 1800 mons. In some ways, it feels like Konami just needed to throw away a backlog of card designs, and here you go. B4 deeply affected the meta. A new generation of beaters emerged, and digging through your deck greatly fastened thanks to the recent release of Magician of Faith, of whom could recur Charity or Greed. Don't forget that the two magic cards were both unlimited. This is great for the lucky duelist. However, if you don't draw into your cards earlier than your opponent, you would be at a serious disadvantage. Turboing through your deck to simply set a faith meant for a lack of strategy as well. So suddenly you have a simplified format defined by a draw resource system. Tell me the difference between this and modern play. Also, I need to remind you, per these booster overviews, that all these cards were in a randomized vending machine, meaning they were tougher to get than the volume sets. But at least the key cards were all common, with the rares being saved for the Tribal Destruction reprints, which, in regards to that, I'm sure duelists at the time would have preferred reprints of bigger cards, but I digress. Though I must admit, looking back in retrospect, the set was awesome. It's not defined by one or two cards. You get a lot of strong cards that would define early TCG Yu-Gi-Oh! Wicked Worm Beast and Lojin in Yugi Kaiba format, Gemini Elf in Android format, and Graceful Charity for the first few years in general. It's fascinating because a lot of these OCG sets have been ultimately lackluster. I mean, we actually got a couple of traps in here, which was not a guarantee in these early sets. Also, decks could have a solid mix of effect monsters and strong beaters without feeling too lopsided. On top of that, we got two new fusions, which, while they needed 3 materials making them unplayable, at least Konami was showing that fusions with higher than 2k attack were going to be more common moving forward. Though let's hope that the high attack wasn't coinciding with the 3 fusion materials, because that would be a really bad choice for them to make. Perhaps it's just me looking at the positives here. But at the time, yes, B4 was less power creep and more power jump. It was defined by a powerful magic card and the low-class, high-attack family. The heavy additions made the card-ass pulls all the more annoying for duelists. Much like the starter box format, the meta depended on if you had these new cards or not. And maybe that's why they added so many strong beaters, so you had more chance to get into them. As such, B4 was generally seen as a horrifying period, all things considered. Decks boiled down to either a good stuff build, a revival build, or a turbo build with Skellengel, a far cry from what would have been the ideal deck had power creep been in check. Dark Equip, get that out of here. Needless to say, it was a delicate period for the game's health, considering the instant inflation of power and speed. But what do you all think? Was B4 as game-changing as many believe? What was your favorite card from the set? Don't get too comfortable, because what comes next may change your heart. Change of heart. The next set has change of heart. Can I be any more clear about this? Change of heart, change of heart, change of heart. Okay, I'm done. This was as big a shift, if not bigger, than what Volume 4 presented with Summon Skull. With the new volume on the horizon, this means a fresh lineup of cards that are easier to obtain than the booster sets, and thus fresh soil for a new meta to bloom. Here we have Volume 5, released on September 23rd, 1999. Man, the year is going by fast, isn't it? At this point in time, the meta was defined by powerful beaters and draw sources alike. Yu-Gi-Oh was solidifying its gameplay loop in a way that would be recognized by early TCG standards. This is recognized further by Volume 5, which many of you may look at it and notice its resemblance to the 2002 TCG core set, Metal Raiders. Imagine if we got cards like Dark Rabbit, Dungeon Worm, and Rose Spectre of Dun this early. Not that it would impact the metagame in any fashion, it's just interesting to ponder about. I mean, there's still a chunk of cards we've yet to receive over in the West, such as Acid Crawler, Bioplant, and Yugioh. Which one would you want to see get imported? And this is my monthly reminder that I would love a Lost Cards set. Konami clearly knew that they opened Pandora's box with Booster 4. As such, there are no notable strong low-level monsters here. The best of the bunch are Armored Zombie, Hyosube, and Pale Beast with a now measly 1500 attack stat. We've come a long way, huh? That's because in V5 there was a greater emphasis on effect monsters. Introducing new monsters that can direct attack on command. While bountiful, it's evident that Konami was scared on their usage, and thus the lineup all have weak attack, with Jinzo number 7 being the strongest, sitting at 500 attack, a slow burn card at best. Other cards would be of similar poorness, like Blast Juggler and Larva Moth, though Big Eye would have some use in regards to stacking your draws. More importantly, when it comes to low-level effect monsters, are the new advantage-gaining monsters. Mass Sorcerer lets you draw a card if it inflicts battle damage, which even works if it successfully defends against an attacker. On the other side of the coin, White Magical Hat rips a card from your opponent's hand should it inflict damage as well. These are great cards in terms of gaining quick advantage, though the meta climate would not foster this duo right away. Lastly, we have the first ever high-level effect monsters, Saga of the Thunder, Suijin, and Kazejin. Yes, now you can actually summon Gate Guardian off of its attended effect. That is to say, if you're willing to take the challenge, because most people would not want to. Considering that each piece takes 2 tributes, your best line of play would be to abuse the Resurrection rule and combo Gate Guardian with Charity and Reborn. Especially looking at one piece individually, Summon Skull is simply the superior choice. Even more so on release since the pieces did have slightly different effects. Normally they all share the effect where, once while they're on the field, a monster attacking into them gets their attack reduced to 0. But in V5, their effects only reduce damage taken to 0, which was so bad that Konami changed it to the modern effect upon their next printing in October 2000. So while Konami attempted to remedy the beater issue, it was clear that they were still holding back in the effects department. That aside, one of the coolest cards you can get from the set has to be Black Skull Dragon, which, yes, it translates to Black Demon's Dragon and not B Demon's Dragon. This card's a bit interesting as, taking a look at the Bandai art, it looks more in line with the pink hues of Bandai's Summon Skull. The manga certainly looks like it was meant to have white bones akin to Summon Skull's OCG artwork, so I can only fathom that Konami read Black Skull Dragon as literally Black Skull. But as a card, this is the strongest readily available fusion monster since Ultimate Dragon and Meteor Black were both prize cards. Unfortunately, while Summon Skull is played in most decks, running Red Eyes and Polymerization is a tough task. Long since been the days of playing Blue Eyes White Dragon to make this guy worth it. With Black Skull out of the way, the chase card of V5 is definitely Change of Heart. Steal a monster for a turn. Wow. It doesn't matter if it's face up, face down, stronger or weaker, if it exists on your opponent's field, you can nab it. You may already see where this is heading to. Summon Skull plays, baby. This translates to indirect removal for the cost of 1 card. Moreover, this could be offset should your stolen monster be a flip monster like the popular Magician of Faith. And Heart is not once per turn, so you could potentially steal 2 monsters, if not more, if you also control a set Faith. Also, Heart is at 3, so yeah, this snowballs to ensure more potential game-winning pushes. One thing that was nice about V5 compared to previous sets were the sheer amount of back row cards. Remember, a set like Volume 4 didn't even include a single trap card, despite it including Mask of Darkness. Perhaps it was at this point where Konami pivoted to cover all types of cards and plays, not just beaters and magic, which could have been a reflection of the Duel Monsters video game's mindset. Because you look at Heart, where it lives based off of player interaction, which beforehand was minimal. Another such card is Soul Release, further emphasizing that increased intercommunication. Something interesting is that it was possible that, on release, Soul Release had to banish from both players' graveyards. Quote, remove up to 5 cards from each player's graveyards. These cards cannot be used during that duel. Unquote. Another point of discussion is that the last set had Call of the Grave, and this set also included Call of Darkness, both cards that counter Monster Reborn, which clearly meant Konami wanted as many cards that could counter Reborn as possible. Which is ironic that Cheerful Coffin was introduced here too, which was designed to combo with Reborn. This is not to say that Heart was the only power card, as V5 introduced Duelist to tribute to the Doomed. Despite it needing a cost, it removes any selected monster proactively. Unlike Fissure, it can hit face-down monsters, making it more in line with Heart. Though both cards do require careful handling, as it can easily backfire if the target is suboptimal like a wall, or the fear of an incorrect play may benefit the opponent the following turn. On the flip side, setting a monster now brings a risk for the owner. This ultimately slowed down the draw games of Volume 4's era. Now Duelists may even set beaters in preparation for a Doomed. This was a bargaining format. And of course, the big cards also came in the brand new rarity, Ultra Parallel Rare, which brought up the issue of certain duelists knowing the card they would draw due to the foil's traction, similarly to the booster set Prince, but possibly in a slightly easier fashion to the trained duelist. Think about the TCG's Hobby League cards. In terms of what the deck game looked like, we started to see a change here. With all these overt power cards, good stuff was less pile of solid cards and more this is the standard to which decks need to be. Thus, the concept of the standard deck was born. Now it wasn't just high firepower and excellent draw cards, but you had amazing removal cards to boot. Games in comparison to past formats were fast, which is unfortunate due to V5 introducing new strategies like low and high axis effect monsters. It's like all the top decks meshed together for what you could potentially call a tier 0 format filled with mind games. Though I suppose a mass virus deck could still be played since Mass Sorcerer is an additional target to Crush Card Virus alongside Mask of Darkness, a strategy that could deal with the abundant beaters. Still worth mentioning, but some people who had access to it were trying out Exodia at the time, albeit at a very early stage in the deck's inception. Also, technically speaking, Gate Guardian was possible too. And of course, Price of Blood was still around in certain areas. That is to say, none of these decks were big in regards to the overall meta, historically speaking. There's a lot to talk about Volume 5. It continued the chaos started in Volume 4 by adding more interactable elements via, while balanced, still incredibly powerful tools. Even still, given the card pool and the minuscule limited list, variety was non-existent from the environment. Konami had a change of heart in relation to the direction of the game, yet it was more of an adjacent lane than anything. If they wanted the game to not self-destruct, they would have to reduce the speed limit. With such a lopsided landscape, here comes Booster 5 on October 17th. The set advertised even more strength, which meant Konami clearly knew what they were doing for this 5th vending machine installment. That statement may be ironic, considering the strongest beaters in the set were a trio of 1600 dinosaurs, Dragon Zombie, Crawling Dragon number 2, and two-headed King Rex. Wait, Dragon Zombie? Well, some in the past once thought dinosaur bones were that of dragons, which helped perpetuate dragon stories of old, the more you know. This only meant that if you're playing schoolyard decks, then perhaps a dinosaur deck with the new beaters, Wasteland, and the new fusion Brachio Radius may have been on your radius. Also, one card to quickly note is Pot the Trick, which may have been the first OCG exclusive counterpart I saw, cementing the strangeness of the original game in my head. I was aware of the method in the TCG by Metal Raiders with Gyakuten Megami and Empress Judge, but which OCG recolor did you first see? Booster 5 was when duelists would see more effect monsters on average. With Volume 5 introducing high-level effect monsters, Booster 5 likewise would feature the first mid-level, non-flip effect monsters in Machine King and Dragon Seeker. Otherwise, Reaper of the Cards would be considered first. King would be the main card advertised here as, unlike Summon Skull, which was an ultra rare in Volume 4, King was a common. So if you missed out on Skull, you now had a relatively strong monster that was easier to obtain. Settling for a 2300 attack post base effect, one tribute monster was great for the budgeted duelist, or if you were a fan of machines in general. And I suppose its effect could come into play since Mechanical Chaser was popular. On the flip side, there was Dragon Seeker, which did not have a particularly strong attack stat of 2k. This card had a niche effect of destroying a single dragon monster upon Seeker's normal or flip summon. All this meant was, you could side Seeker in if your Yugioh area ran a Blue Eyes build, or if someone was playing the Blue Eyes discard deck, which would be considered a rogue strategy in this meta. This Dragon Killer would have fitted better in Volume 2's era, let alone now. Both cards would get obscure first prints in the TCG, with Seeker being in Tournament Pack 2 in 2002, and King being a Duelist League promo in 2004. There are still some cards we have yet to get imported, such as the aforementioned Pot the Trick, Turtle Raccoon with its big belly button, and Machine Attacker. Crocodilius when? Which import would you like to see? All that said, the main course of Booster 5 has to be Needleworm. When this insect is flipped face up, your opponent must send the top 5 cards of their deck to the graveyard. Let me introduce you to the concept of deck destruction. The idea is to use cards to make your opponent's deck run out as quickly as possible. This is due to the ruling that if your opponent has no cards left to draw, the game ends. I use that terminology very specifically because at this point in the game, in Series 1, if a duelist deck runs out, then the duelist with the higher life points wins. As a result, deck destruction was considered in a beta stage, even if the idea of winning via a rule that didn't affect board state must have been rather intriguing. Regardless, Needleworm was much better than Needle Ball, which I'm not even going to talk about because it's just really bad. The deck even got a complimentary card in Morphing Jar. Yeah, here he is. Jar is indirect DD support as it, when flipped, makes both players discard their hands and draw 5 new cards. It can be a great tool to replenish your hand and get rid of an opposing strong hand, whilst having the drawback of giving your opponent a possible beneficial refresh, or you draw into a bunch of stinkers as well. So it has a tactical element to its strong power. This also made duelists more likely to set cards than ever before to prepare or to at least bluff Jar. In turn, Harpy's Feather Duster would gain strength to punish these plays. More draw power, yay! At least those rare Exodia decks can now get checked. Almost as if to offset this, we'd also receive Just Desserts, the first burn trap in the game. Even though burn decks don't exist by this point, the trap can make use as a way to work around the lack of beaters DD played and the life point rule when it comes to decking out. This may have been a reason why Mysterious Puppeteer was released in B5 too, as Konami's way to counter a base 500 point burn card. Additionally, as another way to deter desserts and the setting style that Jar would push, Royal Decree would also be released here. If you're unaware, this is a continuous trap that has the new effect of completely shutting off fellow trap cards. In certain formats, Decree would be undeniably strong. However, by this point, traps were scarce in decks. As such, Decree on release was considered a generally weak card. If anything, having a card to blanket negate traps only furthered the pink card's low adoption rate. Funny how that happens. The same applies to the new effect monster, Trap Master, though Trap would go on to be a solid tool in the TCG's first format. This is to say, Standard did not budge whatsoever. While you could play Masked Virus, historically speaking the deck was rare to come across considering Crush Card Virus was a video game promo and Mask of Darkness did not receive a reprint since Volume 4, unlike some other V4 cards. deck destruction simply did not have the speed nor power to outplay Standard's aggressive strategy. It could play the slow and steady game if not for the current rulings being in beatdown's favor. Thus, any small scratch to DD gave the deck all the more difficulty to win. Which is a shame that Konami tried a different type of deck, only for it to be squandered due to the rules they themselves set. The meta stayed exactly where it was during Volume 5's metagame, if not more in the direction of Standard than before. But at least the game did get a chunk of new cards, usable to different degrees. Machine King, Morphing Jar, Needleworm, Royal Decree, and Just Desserts. Yeah, no magic cards in this set, oddly enough. But what do you all think? Is Booster 5 worthy of its poor outlook, or does the sum of its parts justify the set's existence? The OCG isn't going to stay stagnant for too long because the game gets countered. Then on November 18th, 1999, Volume 6 was released, which continued to further Yu-Gi-Oh's development. The set would mostly be known for its new inclusion of counter traps, or at least what they would eventually be referred to as. This is because, on release, the classification of the counters would be called the same name as all the other existing trap cards, similar to how continuous traps aren't classified as such, just not stating they are destroyed after activation. These would later be identified as their own class since their function is to stop other cards. This gives the back row a new axis of power without creating a third back row card type. And these are powerful, as you have Magic Negation, Trap Negation, Summon Negation, and a catch-all Omni Negate. Magic Jammer and 7 Tools of the Bandit would be pretty solid in a vacuum for what they do. I mean, being able to stop powerful spells and traps was nothing to scoff at, whereas Horn of Heaven is more or less a worse trap hole. Although considering trap hole was limited at the time, this would be an unlimited secondary option if you greatly value the on-summon removal. The last new trap would be the strongest in Solemn Judgment. To stop spells, traps, and summons equals overwhelming versatility, even if it was just normal summons. Any deck can use it, though it does cost half your life points. Heck, the first time I saw the card in the TCG, I thought it was a dud. Apparently, OCG duelists at the time thought so too, or at least relative to the meta. Back then, duelists put higher value on their life points, as well as placing more stock in cards that affect more in battling over hindering your opponent otherwise. Losing half of your life points is incredibly risky in a format where aggressive pushes are the norm, so Solemn Judgment would work better in the side deck at best, which is surprising considering how powerful this card is to stop just about anything, especially at this point when most cards had a single function. Though as time went on, the card would get reevaluated and as such adopted in higher frequencies. The other major inclusion in Volume 6 has to be the two searchers, Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest. Each corresponds to an attack and defense stat, and when they're sent to the grave, you can add a monster that meets that stat criteria from your deck to your hand. So Sangan could search more defensive monsters like Giant Soldier of Stone, and Witch could search stronger monsters like Summon Skull. Plus, at this point in the game, the card text was that they get their effects regardless of how they're sent, meaning a card like Graceful Charity could dump one and still get their effect off. So now Graceful could essentially be viewed as a card that doesn't lose you any cards, since you get new cards in return. You could also consider a Tribute to the Doom to have gained value by this method as well. Another benefit to the Searchers, no, not the phenomenal John Wayne movie, is that they don't need to be flipped, and makes your opponent's removal options for it wasteful. And the removal means you can potentially swing tempo in your favor if a Witch turns into a Gemini Elf to help you get over your opponent's threats. Both are incredibly flexible cards that their main disadvantage is that they don't do much pre-destruction. I mean, at least Sangan works with Crush Card Virus. Sangan into Mask of Darkness only means more virus uses in both available monsters and trap uses. Mask Virus is back, baby! This leads us to new monsters that can be searched from said searchers. First off is Muka Muka, that increases its attack depending on how many cards you have in hand. So for a weak monster, it can reach 2100 attack with only 5 cards in your hand, which is obviously strong. At this point, there was no hand size limit, meaning Muka could potentially beat over a Blue Eyes. Though, on the contrary, if you have that many cards, that means those are cards sitting in your hand. Alternatively, if you use those cards, then Muka will become naturally weaker. It's a catch-22. Muka is a monster that takes more finesse than the average card. Other notable cards include Cannon Soldier. By tributing one monster on your field, you can inflict 500 damage to your opponent. Wow, an activation effect! This is new. While not at its peak quite yet, the burn damage can stack up, in addition to being able to trigger your searchers on command. We'd also see the Attribute Boosters, a series of monsters that, while on field, increase specific attributes and decrease other specific attributes. Even though they're fragile by themselves, a 500 widespread attack buff is strong. Unfortunately, playing traps like Kunai gave duelists less risk with more rewards, since traps can be used when most convenient, with any monster, and without using a summon. You could compare these to being as specific as Equip Magic, which vanished from the meta long ago. Other odd cards would be Air Eater and Flame Cerberus. Yeah, Cerberus, even though its OCG name is just Flame Cerberus. Unsure why Konami to this day has never fixed it, but I digress. These two cards are notable for being both solid tribute monsters for the budget duelist. While the last set we did see Machine King, it was a booster set, which made these ones in a volume set to be easier to obtain, even if their attack powers are noticeably lower, with both sitting at 2100 attack, whereas Machine King has 2300 post-effect. Volume 6 would continue having some questionable effect monsters like Dragon Piper. This flip destroys Dragon Capture Jars, if only dragons were still meta relevant. Alongside this was Great Moth, which you could consider the budget version of its perfect version. It is to that as Machine King was to Summon Skull. That said, Ultimate Great Moth was only really used in UO decks, in which Great Moth would not fit in any capacity. There's also Shadow Ghoul, which is pretty bad in most scenarios. At least V6 gave us a polymerization reprint, with alt art no less. This is much needed considering it is necessary to access the fusion deck at all. Alongside the new fusions, Musician King requires Witch as one of its fusion materials. So translated, you have another way to proactively send Witch to the grave and get a special summon out of it, something that was uncommon at the time. You just needed to play Lady of Faith, which was an otherwise useless vanilla. Interestingly enough, you may wonder why its fusion materials are so unfitting. Well, considering the musician is clearly inspired by heavy metal guitarists of the 1970s and 80s, the materials fit that theme when translating. Lady of Faith's OCG name is High Priestess, and Witch's is about the same as her TCG name. And would you look at that, bands called Judas Priest and Angel Witch. Perhaps King's name should have been Guitar in Roses, or Zipper Man. Lastly, let's bring up the singular card, Giltia the D Knight. Again, another weird translation where its OCG name is Giltia the Magical Knight. I'm unsure why the TCG name becomes Giltia the D Knight, because the D supposedly means dark, which is ironic given its light type, something that has been giving it use in later formats. Even weirder is that this new card and the new Thousand Dragon were both normal monsters in the anime. With Flame Swordsman previously released, all these cards were Joey's cards that got turned into vanillas. He really got screwed. Not the first time and not the last time this color change would occur. That's pretty much it in regards to V6's card pool. The push of weak effect monsters were definitely felt, more so in regards to the Searchers, of whom gave the largest buff to one of the scariest decks in Yu-Gi-Oh history, Exodia. While those lucky few who had a complete set of the Forbidden One did try the deck out in the past, having two Searchers, which were at 3, that can search any piece out, greatly accelerated Exodia's win condition. We see this in modern critter format decks, where the constant resource loop to eventually achieve what you need is not a strategy to ignore. But over in the OCG, add 2 more copies of the Searcher in the mix, in addition to using Monster Reborn, and you can see the ease in achieving a checkmate. Suddenly, Standard now has a disadvantage when it comes to attacking. Or if they remain in attack mode, the other duelists can simply crash their Searcher to achieve a search proactively. Remember, with the current card pool, if a Sangan hit the field, unless your opponent did nothing, that monster only had one place to go, the graveyard. It was not a deck you wanted to play the long-term game with either, since Exodia can end games faster than Standard. Don't you forget that Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity, Monster Reborn, and Swords of Revealing Light were all unlimited as well. This is when the deck destruction duo of Booster 5 would become more useful. More so since, if you recall, there is no hand limit, meaning the opponent could hoard pieces. On the bright side, Exodia was still difficult to build given the scarcity of the 5-piece combination. Reminds me of the early TCG when it took me a few years just to see a complete Exodia set. November 18th, 1999 marked an interesting shift in Yu-Gi-Oh! Konami clearly knew that beatdown was becoming an issue and injected the game with effect monsters and trap cards galore. I can't undervalue the strength Exodia received from this set. What's scarier is that due to card availability, Exodia wasn't even at its prime yet. Tokyo Dome or Volume 6, Exodia was surrounded only by controversy. But you could see the writing on the walls should Exodia see a reprint soon, ignoring if any other cards come out that support the strategy. At the very least, duelists were more apprehensive to play such a degenerate solitaire deck. Safe to say that this was the start of a dark period of the OCG. We start by entering the Chamber of Booster 6 on December 1st, 1999. This card-ass set proclaims to show your duelist, which made sense given this supplementary roster of cards was geared to the meta-inclined individual. The primary focus would be for the fusion mechanic. Yes, the mechanic that would be considered rogue at best with the likes of Musician King now gets support that was long overdue. Because fusion summoning was always awkward with you needing the fusion monster, its 2 or 3 materials, and the card polymerization to commence fusion. It's not like a lot of these cards were printed in the same set, they were released sporadically. So for a while it was a strategy meant for hardcore fans. That said, how does B6 improve the purple cards? And will it be enough to shake up the meta? Firstly, we received fusion substitute monsters. Now you don't need every specific material for a fusion monster, such as you could summon Gaia the Dragon Champion with Curse of Dragon and Mystical Sheep, instead of trying to track down that ultra-rare Gaia the Fierce Knight from Volume 1 way back in the year. This opens up the possibilities of how one can create fusion, since any of the subs can go with any of the fusion monsters. Now, they were designed for only using one sub per fusion monster. You couldn't just use 2 Versagos or 1 Versago and a goddess with a third eye for a Crimson Sunbird. But you know how Series 1 works, right? The original text was confusing, creating misconceptions that you could use 2 subs. This would be cleared up in Series 2, but considering fusions are inherently coarse, it wasn't as big an issue as Ultimate Offering was. Thankfully, some search and salvage cards helped alleviate some of that crudeness. Fusion Sage is a forward design card in the sense that it searches poly straight from the deck. This is a fantastic way to access fusions, and a card I'm surprised didn't come to the TCG sooner than Torment Pack 6 in mid-2005. But you know how Series 1 works, right? Poly in the OCG is simply called Fusion, and the card's OCG text reads, add 1 fusion spell card from your deck to your hand. Does this mean fusion specifically, or any spell card that includes fusion support? This confused some people, even if additional fusion spells were non-existent at this point. The other alleviator was Monster Eye, the Poly Salvage monster. For 1,000 life points, you can return a Poly from the grave to your hand. It's not bad if you have the life points to spare, more so since it isn't once per turn, meaning you could possibly pull some explosive fusion plays when you want, because dumping Poly with Charity only to return it at your convenience isn't the worst option out there. This is another card I'm surprised hasn't seen more TCG releases beyond 2 World Championship packs, which leads us to the main course. Here we get Cyberstein. While infamous in the halls of Yu-Gi-Oh's Royal Magical Library, by this point Stein was seen as a decent tech option in standard decks. This is because it can summon any fusion monster with a cost of 5,000 life points, and at this point in any position. A heavy slope, but one that can add some serious pressure if you summon the right monster for the job. Imagine bypassing the need of 3 specific cards in favor of just 1. It's a double-edged sword. More so when considering the fusions at the time were just big beaters. Well, some of them anyways. Hey, big beaters in a beatdown deck did allow for some aggressive pushes that the strategy needed in a meta where Exodia could jump out of the dark. Immediately summoning a Black Skull Dragon could make a difference in game state. Funny how a fusion-specific card became more used in general decks. Duelists who were fans of the more casual fusion deck would rather run the pure elements and not cheat around the method. If only a weaker Stein existed. At least this Series 1 iteration of Stein was less of the OTK machine it would be known as, so count your blessings of the Nile. If you're wondering about those last 3k life points after using Stein, then Gale Dogra's got your back. Even though you can't use both of them without any LP increase. This is a card I've discussed in its own video, but I'll repeat some of the sentiments here. Dogra is like a weaker Stein, see what I did there? That needs to use Reborn as a combo piece. Since by paying 3k LP, Dogra can send a fusion monster from the fusion deck to the grave. Despite the revival restriction being brought up most recently in October's Jump 48, it was only in reference to conditional monsters like Gate Guardian and Magician of Black Chaos, because fusions existed elsewhere, and at the time, there was no other way to summon them aside from the original method. Thus, Dogra was intended to function as one would expect, even if Konami would change their minds on the ruling come Series 2, completely mitigating Dogra's effect aside from certain graveyard plays like Bazoo, Chaos Summoning, or even Albaz fusions. Funnily enough, many play the gacha machines in hopes of pulling Poly. However, that card was not featured in the set that so heavily promoted it. At least it was recently reprinted in Volume 6. Instead of Poly or fusion support thereof, the set included a number of interesting cards you could obtain. Penguin Soldier bounces up to 2 monsters when flipped, much better than Hain, as aside from the obvious double bounce, it could potentially bounce itself to be reused. This would be a more versatile card to punish Stein plays, be a soft removal for the searchers without triggering their effects, or stall a game out. Green Kappa could likewise destroy 2 set back row cards. Sadly, it wouldn't be that useful given duelists tended to shotgun back row cards in this environment. Speaking of, the set would cater to the metagame with cards like Magical Thorn, which would inflict burn damage when your opponent discards cards. This is a clear interaction with Charity, and was advertised as a combo with Morphing Jar. It even works with Dogra due to Thorn's original text. You know how Series 1 works, right? Because Thorn only cared for the card sent as long as it was due to an effect and not cost, so Jammer and Doomed wouldn't trigger it. Though if anyone did play Thorn, I bet they wouldn't care and use it against Jammer anyways. Everything is inferred, and quite frankly, it's frustrating to research this stuff. Anyway, Restructor Revolution was most likely a card made to punish hand hoarders more specifically than to chastise Morphing Jar, though the TCG name is a typo since Restructor isn't even a word, should have been Restructured. We also got more relatively useless Tribal Destruction cards, and another budget-friendly tribute monster in Ushioni, of whom has ever so slightly higher attack than the mid-class monsters in V6. And that's all there is worth mentioning in B6. Yet we're not done with the card pool yet. Only 8 days later, we'd see the True Duel Monsters promo cards. Yep, this is our analog of Forbidden Memories, where buyers would receive randomly 3 of 5 promotional items to possibly add to their dueling repertoire. Being a significantly smaller lineup than the DM2 promos meant that these would be easier to obtain. First off would be Harpy's Pet Dragon, which would fit in any Harpy deck, if anyone played Harpies in the first place. The rest were all part of the new Metal Morph line. Fans of Bandit Keith rejoice. Metal Morph is a battle trap similar to Kunai with Chain. Heck, some even thought it would replace Kunai. It lets a weak monster almost assuredly attack over a strong one by gaining half of the target's attack. Now a Harpy Lady could punch over a Blue Eyes. Whoa. But it's only when you're attacking and thus dead during your opponent's turn aside from the minimal 300 buff. Needless to say, it did not replace the popular chain-attached Boomerang. The rest of the new cards tied into this one trap: Zoa, Metal Zoa, and Red Eye's Black Metal Dragon. The 2 metal monsters have a unique summoning rule in which they summon themselves from the deck. Interesting if not for the fact that the cost of a high-level vanilla equipped with a trap buff for a monster with barely an attack upgrade wasn't worth it. if you even considered it an upgrade in the first place, because while their base attack is higher, they lose the half attack effect. They needed attack prowess closer to Gate Guardian. That said, some people enjoyed the metal theme, but it was more of a cult following than anything. Lastly, alongside the game was a strategy guide that included the long-awaited Black Magic Ritual. Now duelists could finally summon that Magician of Black Chaos they pulled back at the Tokyo Dome. Finally, there was a second ritual monster option that wasn't the pitifully weak Dokuro Rider. Manga enjoyers were surely happy. Well, they better be, because if not, the card would not be meta viable in this meta climate, which is unfortunate since Black Chaos is a fairly strong special summonable monster, something that could be played in a more real-life situation than discarding and reviving a Blue Eyes or using Stein for Black Skull or whatever people are still doing with Ultimate Offering. Another card that took the TCG way too long to get. So then, what was the meta scene like? Booster 6 changed a lot while not changing much at the same time. It was important in making fusion plays possible in more than just a rogue strategy, but their best weapon fitted better in standard beatdown decks. It helped Standard keep a line of defense against the toxicity of Exodia. That is to say, if you didn't let Exodia play Solitaire and avoid the issue altogether. Really, the best defense against the Forbidden deck was the fact that it was still difficult to build and strategy stigma at the time. For those who did get the deck running, they would start to cut Change of Heart to avoid enemy morphing jars, as well as adding Solemn Judgment to stop said jars and Needleworms. They were adapting. Speaking of Solemn, you know how Series 1 works, right? Some people at the time weren't even sure if cards like Solemn and Horn of Heaven could stop flips. While I use modern terms like flip and special summons, old terminology just used words like becomes face up, put, and fuse. But it appears that due to a lack of rulings by Konami, the player base made their own verdict on the issue and ruled that the summon negation cards could be used on any action that places a monster onto a monster's zone, and not the thesaurus of words the cards themselves use. Either that or Konami mentioned it somewhere that we currently don't have access to. Overseas research, yay! In summary, Booster 6 is an important yet weird side set. It's a small addition to the card pool, yet more effective than some volume sets. Effective in regards to its constructed deck push, and not a complete overhaul to the meta itself. All the new fusion support was much needed, but it's like giving out a participation ribbon to make the deck feel important, while the shadow of the actual athletes loomed over it like the Great Pyramid of Giza. Oh, but Duelist, we gave you fusion support, Harpy support, Metal Morph cards, and even a way to summon Magician of Black Chaos. What more do you want? Konami so enthusiastically proclaims. Nevertheless, they are fun cards, if nothing else. And a lot to discuss for that matter, something this series is evidently growing in. Goodness. You could argue this is where the metagame truly began, with card theory and tech becoming a crucial part of Yu-Gi-Oh!, where player expression was at an all-time high, more than in the past where duelists picked their favorite flavors of Equip Magic. Though it was transparent that the two popular flavors nowadays are simply vanilla and chocolate, with not much room for mint chocolate chip. Dang it, now I'm hungry. Booster 6 and Hovering releases didn't change much in regards to the status quo, but it was a fun addition if anything, especially considering the fusion mechanic didn't have much going for it beforehand. But then on December 16th, everything would change with the release of the EX Starter Box. This pre-constructed deck box is similar to the starter box back in March. Not to compare the two, since this box included much more thoughtful decks that even included a side deck, where the starter box was more of a gimmick to promote and play Yu-Gi-Oh! At a casual level. The EX starter box had easier cohesion for new players to jump into what the game had evolved into throughout 1999. And even the reprint of the rulebook gave more availability to players to have a better understanding of certain intricacies, such as the revival rule. It also reminded me that main phase 2 didn't exist at this point. Rather, after the battle phase, it would go back to the simple main phase and then to the end phase after that. Main phase 2 was added later as a way to describe this shift better. The box also contained plenty of new cards that we would recognize as the TCG's 2002 Yugi and Kaiba starter decks. So if you're in need of respectable cards that partially filled the gaps of cards you missed out beforehand, then cards like Wall of Illusion, Neo the Magic Swordsman, Lord of D, Flute of Summoning Dragon, and Judgment would be at your disposal. Speaking of, that last card was a solid 1 tribute beater if you didn't have Machine King and wanted more mid-level monsters than the reprinted Summon Skull. Yeah, it turns out this box gave needed reprints aplenty. Other great reprints include Change of Heart, Dark Hole, Monster Reborn, and Trap Hole. This put players on an even playing field since cards like Dark Hole and Gaia the Fierce Knight haven't been reprinted since Volume 1. Even both Dark Magician and Blue Eyes White Dragon received reprints, with new arts no less. While this wasn't the first instance of this, looking at Flame Swordsman, this was a more notable move for Konami to make. Both Dark Magician arts would be based on the monster's appearance in the manga from Duel 62 and 94 respectively, whereas Blue Eyes' first art was from the manga, yet its second art is more of an unknown. I couldn't find any sources from its showings throughout its debut chapter through Duelist Kingdom, even if a variety of panels would wind up as alt art. My best educated guess is that we're aware that Takahashi designs monsters from a variety of angles and poses before he settles on a final design. Blue Eyes must have been a case of this, where Takahashi liked the alternate design enough to even want to use it in Forbidden Memories during early development. Many alternate art would go on to form counterpart cards, like Taihon and Taihon No. 2. My theory is that Takahashi and or Konami didn't want to muddy up popular manga cards like Dark Magician and Flame Swordsman and keep certain cards to have alternate art instead of having the second Blue Eyes card become a totally new, recolored card like, I don't know, Gold Eyes Scarlet Dragon. At the very least, it was a good promotional tactic. Hey, here's a new Dark Magician art. While it's sad that these decks didn't include a fusion deck to capitalize off of Booster 6, and the purpose of the set for that matter, duelists were okay with that when looking at the new power cards the EX starter box introduced. Guess Konami didn't want to reprint Polymerization again so quickly. The big trap here was Waboku. It protects yourself from battle damage for the turn as activated. At this time, no battle destruction protection. It's a great card to punish aggressive pushes and to slow the game down. Even though Swords of Revealing Light is better as a protection tool, having both be available in a deck only caused Beatdown's game plan to become nigh impossible in the face of specific decks like Exodia. So now Beatdown only had one real out, Morphing Jar. This ironically morphed the deck into something new, Anti-Meta Jar. On the other hand, the big spell was Last Will. This card has had a confusing history of rulings throughout the card game, and the OCG is no different. The card typically lets you summon a single 1500 or less attack potent monster from the deck should one of yours get sent to the field to the graveyard the turn you activate Will. Over in the OCG, the wording in its initial print was rather confusing, more or less reading, quote, "During the turn this card is activated, each time one of your monsters is sent to the graveyard, special summon one monster from your deck," unquote. So duelists assumed that this card could bring out as many monsters as one sent to the grave. This seemingly infinite rotation only powered the already fearsome Exodia deck to what could be considered a full power version. Will severely punishes any deck with beaters, since a player could just crash a monster to trigger Will manually. And since Will acts in a continuous state while it's in the graveyard after activation, your opponent can only stop it when it first hits the field. Even if your opponent didn't have a beater, the owner could just do other forms of manual triggering like Dark Hole and Tribute to the Doomed. Some duels would even run Last Day of Witch to destroy extra Exodia pieces for a search if need be. If you send Sangan or Witch of the Black Forest to the grave and trigger Will, not only do you get a summon, but a search as well. So you can imagine how Exodia would immensely benefit from this singular spell. After all, Exodia exclusively ran monsters that Will synergize with prior to its inception. This forced any contending deck to main deck Morphing Jars, even in the mirror match. On top of that, the Conga line of monsters also meant that Cannon Soldier gained considerable power when it came to dealing burn damage. If the Exodia deck needed a backup plan if key pieces were all in the grave, then by burning 16 monsters, you can win the game. Having a machine that can be easily searched by any of the searchers or will meant it could fit in the strategy seamlessly without the worry of looking for it mid-game. At the very least, you can use it to auto-trigger a searcher or will to get the primary strategy going. Cannon Soldier would even work as a deck of its own if you didn't like or have Exodia. After all, the 16 monsters needed for an OTK could be any, or if you played a single Cockroach Knight. This little bugger from Booster 4, when sent to the grave, could be returned to the top of the deck. Then Last Will would trigger, bringing this card back out, and the loop goes on from there. While not as popular as Exodia OTK, Cannon Soldier OTK was still representative of the inherent issues of the game as a whole. It is not hyperbolic to say that Yu-Gi-Oh's metagame completely collapsed. Now, the card's functions were either to facilitate OTKs, or to stop them as fast as possible. The solitaire mindset meant that games could end on the first turn, since attacking didn't mean the same as it once did in the format's past. To ignore the opponent, which was in stark contrast to where the game was heading previously. Exodia reached its full potential in the most toxic of ways. Its best defense was people seeing it ironically as a forbidden deck, aside from Exodia being tough to obtain, which is still true. The December 99 period featured another special event at Jump Festa 2000 between the 18th and 19th. This is an annual manga and anime convention to introduce new material like manga, films, games, merch, etc. At this event, there was a lottery for one of 3,000 copies of a prismatic secret rare Blue Eyes White Dragon. Beforehand, the card only received an ultra rare in the starter box and wouldn't get such a high rarity in Series 1 style until the 25th anniversary Ultimate Kaiba set in 2022. Although it did get the rarity in Duelist Road in 2015, and other relatively high rarities like Ghost Rare and Ultimate Rare at different points in between. Even if you're unable to win one of those luxurious cards, you could also pick up Premium Pack 2 at Jump Festa as well. This sequel to the notorious Premium Pack back at the Tokyo Dome contained only ritual monsters and the respective ritual spells. The lineup would actually be those that were the prize cards at the Duel Monsters National Tournament, but there, they were not only normal monsters, but sealed prizes, making them extremely rare and illegal for play. Due to the meta climate, rituals would still be a collector's item at best, and a casual deck at worst. For Blackluster Soldier would be an upgrade to the previous champion, Magician of Black Chaos. And if you were still dying for some kind of lottery prize, there was an external e-jump lottery going on that ended on December 23rd, with the winner being announced in the upcoming February. Winners would receive one of 1,000 copies of a traditional Chinese ultra-rare Blue Eyes. While the game was not available in the Chinese language, players over there could still play with OCG imports. It appears to be a collaboration between Konami and Hong Kong to advertise the game rather than tease a new language print. Sure, you have a Japanese Blue Eyes, but have you mastered the Chinese one? After all, in the manga, it's insinuated that there are copies of the legendary dragon outside of Japan, and since in lore there are only 4 copies printed, then you better attempt to win this Chinese copy to become just like Kaiba. Lastly, in regards to new material, there was an important page in Jump 3-4 2000. Its in-store date was on December 20th, hence why we're discussing it now. The key takeaway was the ruling clarification when it came to certain cards, such as Swords of Revealing Light staying on field, Crush Card Virus not staying on field, and Monster Reborn in relation to the Resurrection rule. This may have been the first instance of the Fusion Monster Revival rule change, where Jump 48 earlier in the year mentioned conditional monsters, Jump 3-4 mentions special procedures. It's just me inferring this, so take it with a grain of salt, that Konami changed their mind on Gale Dogra due to the potential of Cyberstein. What was the largest resolution was how Sangan and Witch work. It's now on paper that these searchers cannot trigger from hand, making cards like Magic Jammer and Tribute to the Doomed less potent. Though Doom could still destroy your searchers on the field, so, you could still play it. Though back in this time period, not everyone had access to jump magazines or the internet. Thus, the prior use of the searchers would still apply in certain local areas for a few months. While historically the answer of the ruling was a yes-no, and you could argue the format is defined by day of release like EX, it's not far out of the question that this is what Konami have always intended for the cards to function. Therefore, I would decipher EX format as one where the searchers cannot be activated from the hand, considering it was only 5 days between the two items and still in 1999 before the next set. I mean, plenty of earlier formats included later released cards that weren't in core or booster sets. Early December also held the follow-up to the cancelled Tokyo Dome's first national conference that we know little to nothing about aside from the winners, and that this follow-up was held on December 5th. Main point being is that it was possible that the searcher's rulings was also mentioned here prior to the EX box. So obviously the main impact in December was the EX starter box. Not only was it great for beginners, but for mid-level and high-level duelists alike. Like I mentioned earlier, the meta was OTK or anti-OTK. You only had 3 reasonable options. Exodia OTK, which was clearly the strongest yet most difficult to build. Cannon Soldier OTK, which was not as popular but still effective. And Anti-Meta Jar, which was like flipping a coin to it if it even worked in the face of Exodia. You did have casual level decks if you didn't like the horrendous meta. However, don't expect to win any locals lest there was a consensus or not playing toxic cards, or the judge ruled Last Will to work otherwise. EX Beatdown, Blackluster Ritual, and technically Dragon Turbo exists now thanks to the new Lord of D and Flute of Summoning Dragon, which would protect dragons from targeted effects and special summon or special set dragons from your hand respectively. Yeah, you could special set during this. Yu-Gi-Oh! OCG in 1999 was a tempestuous time with plenty of core sets that affected the meta in both minute ways and major ways. It had to work plenty to become a game with depth. That depth would wind up at the bottom of the ocean when the concept of regular play got shafted in favor of single-player affairs. But what do you all think? What's your favorite 1999 format? Would Yu-Gi-Oh! Be able to pick itself back up come the new millennium, or would the final stretch of Series 1 end by OTKing itself? On January 7th, 2000, we received Volume 7. The core set featured a variety of machine monsters used by manga antagonist, Bandit Keith. While most of these would be left in the trash heap, Barrel Dragon was an attraction enough to plenty of duelists. Its high stats and strong effect was an allure, even if the environment didn't have room for such a hefty card. Quite honestly, a large portion of V7's card pool were simply recyclables. If Launcher Spider being the first high-level monster to be common rarity wasn't a sign, I don't know what is. I mean, the only reprint we received was Mystic Horseman, which was only decided upon due to the new release of its connecting fusion, Rabbit Horseman. Though as to why Konami didn't feel the need to reprint any of the other older fusion materials for the new fusion monsters, I will never know. After all, Horseman was printed literally 1 set ago in the EX starter box, compared to Cybersaurus and its materials being last printed in Volume 5 and Booster 5. Cybersaurus just can't catch a break. Speaking of fusions, V7 gave us a couple decent fusion options, one being Labyrinth Tank, which could make use of Cannon Soldier in an additional way for the fusion strategy. You could run Gigatech Wolf too, since its stats are actually decent against searchers. However, the meta scene couldn't fit this card either, like it would in the TCG's Critter format. Likewise, we'd see Twin-Headed Thunder Dragon, that would be a strong beater with materials easier to find than Black Skull Dragon. Its materials, introduced in the set, are 2 copies of Thunder Dragon. One of these can be discarded to search 2 more. This makes for a great way to not only deck thin and fuse, but for discard fodder, like for Graceful Charity, Tribute to the Doomed, and Magic Jammer, as well as getting into a monster that can be tributed over a searcher, and thus comboing with Last Will or finding that last Exodia piece. In regards to Cannon Soldier and the Cannon OTK deck, it got a new option in Catapult Turtle. This mid-level mon could tribute a monster to inflict half of the sent monster's attack as burn damage. In this meta, all you needed was Cockroach Knight to enable an OTK. Thus, the deck had one more option to kill, an option that would work great with Last Will and Change of Heart to get Turtle out easily, because the new burn options in Princess of Tsurugi and Tremendous Fire wouldn't do much for the still beta burn strategy. If you were still a Legacy Beatdown player, then you also got new tools here. Other than 7-color fish as a simple beater, Dark Elf was the standout attacker. This shadowy spellcaster has 100 attack points more than Gemini Elf, which inherently makes it playable. Yes, it does have a downside of paying 1k life just to attack, however, it wasn't half your life like Solemn, and it didn't cost you anything more than a little blood. If your needs were in more removal, then DD Warrior was great as the first monster with a banishing effect. Regardless of its mandatory banish, a 1-to-1 exchange wasn't bad, especially since it clears searchers without them using their own effects, since they don't hit the graveyard first. The beatdown deck even got an anti-Exodia tool in Robin Goblin. This continuous trap allowed the card's owner, who once inflicted battle damage, to rip a random card out of the opponent's hand. Sure, it was random, however, the potential discard of an Exodia piece was great, as well as the searchers now that they don't get their effects off a discard. On the flip side, the Unhappy Maiden and the first hand trap, Karibo, further tested Beatdown's capabilities by ending the battle phase and preventing battle damage respectively. Lastly, I'd like to discuss the other new trap of V7, Mirror Force. This is an iconic card, not just for being the first attack reaction trap, but also being a total blowout card if your opponent wasn't careful. Punishing a careless attack was fantastic in any deck, not just for anti-beatdown tech. Yet you may already guess that its impact was mitigated by this Exodia heavy environment, where many of the decks didn't care too much about attacking, or destruction for that matter. Destroy my Sangan? Sure, go ahead. Nevertheless, its potential was felt, transforming how duelists left monsters in specific battle positions. Volume 7 would have some other effect monsters and back row cards alike. It's just that aside from the ripe fruit, many of the remaining cards were really just filler in the grand scheme of things. I suppose in relation to the playable cards, these just stuck out more as whatever additions. Goes to show just how far the game has gotten thus far, evolving from the humble beginnings of Volume 1 to 6 sets later where reasonable cards had to have more in their deck inclusion argument than just being better than the slot beforehand. When looking at decks from this era, Exodia still reigns supreme. It now has Thunder Dragon to cut the overall deck size down if you can search them out. Plus, it can be used for multiple cards now that you need the searchers to hit the field. Anti-Meta Jar did gain countermeasures thanks to DD Warrior and Robin Goblin. Canon OTK gained a new way to, well, OTK thanks to Turtle. Beatdown also made use of Robin Goblin and its upgrade in beater options. And Fusion had 2 new usable fusions to play around with. And even with all of that, the Exodia OTK was ever the more transparent issue. Honestly, V7 didn't do too much to change anything. It added spice to the card pool, sure. Unfortunately, decks remained in the same spot as before, if not fixing the issues Exodia faced after the ruling change. But I would be lying if I didn't say the spice made it look more fun on the outset. Barrel Dragon, Dark Elf, Shield and Sword, and Karibo certainly were fun cards, as a few examples. Even Mushroom Man number 2 would see play years down the line. But what do you all think? Did Volume 7 do enough as a core set? What's your favorite card in the new pool? Time is running out, as the game will only receive 1 boost after this, and a much needed change. Well, with 1 more main set left in Series 1, will the OCG maintain its toxic status, or will this climactic booster set end the game on a positive note? Firstly, we have quite the big change. On February 3rd, Konami would announce a restriction revision that would be used at the upcoming 2nd National Tournament, aka 2nd National Convention, held on March 19th. This is in a similar function as the Tokyo Dome list was, where it would only be mandated at tournament-related events, of which would begin across Japan this month to filter out the top 8 come said event. That's all fine and dandy, but what exactly got hit this time around? The list would be a continuation from the previous one and not specific per event, hence the revision specificity. Specificity. I cannot say that word to save my life. So Raigeki and Darkhold would still be limited, whereas Trapple was now off the list entirely. Hold not having any limitations now show Konami's awareness for power creep as the game continues to evolve. Also new in regards to limitation options are semi-limited cards that a duelist can only have 2 copies of in their deck. This lineup includes Graceful Charity, Harpy's Feather Duster, and Monster Reborn. Historically, this section is for cards that Konami keeps an eye on to see if it's a major problem, or one that can be laxed down the line. Which makes sense, given Charity lost power with the Searcher's ruling, and Duster and Reborn both have specific uses. Now for newly limited cards, this includes Change of Heart, Pot of Greed, Last Will, Mirror Force, and all 5 Exodia pieces. Most of it, if not all, makes sense. Exodia was a problematic deck to say the least, and Will was a major catalyst for OTKs. Heart and Mirror were hits for good stuff, a deck that can now breathe. And Pot was necessary alongside Charity as to not let duelists dig through their deck as much, thus slowing the game down in both speed and power. It is interesting that Konami didn't hit every power card like the Searchers and Magician of Faith, however. With the February list, Exodia was gutted, roughly removing a quarter of the overall deck. OTKs could still happen like with Exodia or Cannon Soldier burning through monsters, however a player couldn't rely on it without sacrificing win rate. Duelists would still run Exodia as a theoretical FTK, but good stuff conceptually had returned, which clearly helped the metagame by promoting deck diversity. This showed that Konami was keeping tabs on its competitive scene in between major events. An entire month later, on March 1st, Series 1 would receive its final booster set. The set was promoting strategy variety with the likes of support cards such as Pump King, the King of Ghosts, and Castle of Dark Illusions. Aside from the manga-related cards, the real draw was the new Magic card, Heavy Storm. This is to Feather Duster as Darkhold is to Raigeki. While it's not as good in comparison, Duster was just semi-limited, making Storm a great secondary option for back row removal, especially as traps can see more play now thanks to the slowed down game state. In addition, Storm was a common in a booster set, unlike Duster, which was locked as a video game promo. In the monster category, Jirai Gumo was a sight to see thanks to its hefty 2200 attack stat, the peak of low-level beaters, and one that eclipses even Dark Elf. That said, it has a higher downside in that it could potentially cut your life in half. The downside was seen as worse more times than not compared to Gemini Elf, which has 0 downsides, and is why more people play Gemini over Dark Elf. Also remembering that life points play an important factor in the game once again. Duelist sentiment on thinking low-level monsters would get stronger and stronger appeared to be true. The last important card was Dream Clown. This card has unique positional utility to where it gains an effect should it switch battle position. It's like the next evolution of flip monsters since it's not locked to a single use. The benefit being that it can pop a monster, making it great for free face-down removal. And also the reason why it's played more than Crass Clown. And this can be backed up by defensive cards like Swords and Waboku. In an age where good stuff returned, duelists could look at utility monsters like Clown, Penguin Soldier, and Mass Sorcerer as a way to spice up their builds. And that's not all. Booster 7 also introduces Skull Knight, a powerful fusion with low-level materials. Beforehand, any fusion worth its slot for beatdown required monsters that could be bricks like Summon Skull and Thunder Dragon. Skull Knight even beats out Labyrinth Tank and Skull for that matter. Despite its non-bricky materials, both cards are considered underpowered. Other than Tainted Wisdom does beat over Witch, and Ancient Brain ties with Sangan, it's hard to recommend these as a meta-viable strategy, but they do have some merit, so take that for what you will. The final 2 cards I want to quickly discuss are Stimpack and Share the Pain. Stimpack is a 700 equip that has the monster lose 200 attack during your standby phases. This is the next evolution of equips, since many of these 700 buff ones previously were attribute specific like Light Castle and Salamandra. With a card like this, you could use it as a proactive attack buff. though I would be skeptical if it gave life back to the once meta deck. Beatdown could possibly make use of it, whereas Share the Pain is another proactive way to trigger searchers and deal with opposing monsters. It's good for magic-oriented face-down singleton removal, like Tribute to the Doomed, while comboing in a way Doomed used to. Generally, Booster 7 is seen as a weirdly lackluster set to cap off Series 1. The status quo remained the same, where Beatdown and Control battled. Even Exodia as a defensive deck played more like how I imagine Konami intended it to, much like its first incarnation with Skelengel. The game got simplified, but in a good way. More so, the game turned back to its original form and not the combo monstrosity it converted to. Sounds familiar. And now there's significantly more cards in the pool than there was back in the Volume 5 days. Before we get to the big event, let's jump the gun and discuss the final release of Series 1, Dark Ceremony, released on March 23rd. I'm talking about this now due to pacing and power reasons. This is a big reprint set of all the rituals up to this point, and then some. Javelin Beetle, Chakra, Fortress Whale, and Skull Guardian. While being a rarity downgrade, as well as Konami not including any ritual support like they've done with fusions, more options is always nice for player aesthetics. Casually, it's not far out of the question to play a strong BLS deck or a level 7 or 6 fusion-based strategy due to level synergy, or even some janky Javelin Beetle Insect Beatdown deck. Just goes to show the level of variety a post-Exodia format exudes. Going back on track, one day before the second national tournament, March 18th would see the release of Shonen Jump 16. The important takeaway from this is the page that included a note about Last Will receiving an errata. Now, the card's effect could only be used once per card. Konami clearly knew the issue at hand, especially right before the finals of a major tournament. This killed the Cockroach Loop and Typical Cannon Soldier OTKs thereof. Then the fateful day arrives, the culmination of Series 1 Yu-Gi-Oh! The large tournament took place at the Tokyo Big Sight building on March 19th, during the Tokyo Toy Show, the largest toy industry show in Japan at the time. This was a huge opportunity for Konami to show off Yu-Gi-Oh! To a wide audience. Could be the reason behind them neutering Exodia, but that's just a theory. Additionally, this was the first big event with known teams entering, solidifying Yu-Gi-Oh! As a game worth strategizing over. Despite knowing the types of decks the top duelists use like Beatdown, Cannon Burn, and a defensive deck, we only have the winning deck list by Masahiro Okamoto playing a control deck. Nature is healing. What's a bit unnatural were the prize cards. Top 3 would receive specialty made cards that took previously existing cards and morphed their faces onto them. Third place, Tomohiro the Mountain Warrior. Second place, Yasushi the Skull Knight. And of course, first place, Masahiro the Dark Clown. These cards are just bizarre, and real despite Kevin Tewart stating otherwise, despite the cards themselves being illegal for play. Also noticeable is that they use the following Series 2 card layout. Since the art uses the winners' faces, it's tough to know at what point these cards were printed, if it was before or after the Premier Series 2 set. Chicken or the egg type of thing. All in all, this was a great way to end Series 1 Yu-Gi-Oh! Throughout Series 1, Konami clearly had a tough time balancing the game whilst introducing new cards and mechanics. Cream rose to the top and the rest sunk as convoluted wording spread toxic decks like Ultimate Offering and Exodia. The Expert Rules was a much needed addition, giving players agency to express themselves. But this came with the inherent issue of splintering Konami's lead and the metagame. Thankfully, they were able to pivot from, thanks in part to the game's increasing popularity, which made the restriction revision a necessary step, to the point where it would become the widespread public list come April 1st. In retrospect, despite Series 1's tempestuous history, it had plenty of positives, from the equip days of the official rules, to the inclusion of Blue Eyes White Dragon, to the Tokyo Dome's Rogue Doll meta, to its climax at the Tokyo Big Sight. There's plenty to appreciate from the game's first year and change. Hopefully, I was able to cover as much of its importance throughout the series without getting too microscopic, nor too macro. Hey, maybe I'll even do a Yu-Gi-Oh! CG Series 2 if you all want. Series 2 would officially begin on April 18th with the Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters anime hitting the airwaves, with the first set coming out 2 days later. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. That'll be a story for another day.